Avery couldn't believe he was no match for David's strength. In the center of the shattered ground, the soft soil had been compressed into something like solid rock. Purple ripples ran across David's skin like light waves on a star, and the violet glow in his eyes burned like twin suns, awe-inspiring enough to make him look like a god come down to earth. He spoke slowly, coldly. "Clearly, you're not fast enough." The force of the last punch had forced Avery to rely on raw physical strength. The purple light emanating from David masked the unusual color of his skin so no one noticed. Avery staggered. This power. Falcone and the others hauled themselves up and crowded to the window, staring down with open horror. The ground below had been compacted by a terrifying force to a depth of tens of centimeters, leaving a crater dozens of meters wide. It looked as if missiles had carpet-bombed the block, and yet it had been the result of nothing more than an exchange of punches between two men. Batman tightened his fists, shock flickering across his face. He looked conflicted and unsettled. "I don't believe it." Avery planted his boots and charged again like a cannonball, roaring as he swung a fist. How could he be stopped here? This was just some small city on this planet. Your attack is as shallow as your rebellious brain, too easy to read. Avery's supersonic punch tore through the air, but David caught it effortlessly. He was testing the limits of Clark's current power and had no intention of toying with Avery any longer. With deliberate calm, he lifted his other hand and revealed a green glowing ring, kryptonite. The radiation hit Avery like a flood. Avery clutched his head, his divine energy, comparable to a battleship's, draining away in an instant. He crumpled to his knees, horror written across his face as he looked up at the man holding him. "How do you, my weakness?" David had no interest in answering. As Black King, Avery could boost various aspects of his body by consuming internal energy, strength, speed, endurance. But in his normal state, his strength only matched the Colossus class, and his speed was only a few dozen times faster than a normal person. Any higher, and his fragile body risked tearing itself apart from the energy. Under Universe Energy Enhancement, he could push speed to 4 or 5 times the speed of sound. Not as fast as Clark, but the gap had narrowed. With Avery's powers, catching him became far less difficult. With a final shove, David knocked Avery unconscious, his face ballooned and bruised. David dragged the man, ring still on his finger, preparing to leave. Then he remembered Falcone. He turned, raised a finger, and a beam of force shot through the air. The wall where Falcone had been standing on the 5th floor exploded. The mobster went flying out the broken window. He screamed as he fell, but Batman fired a grapnel and swung to catch him, saving the Gotham crime lord from being smashed to pulp before his trial. "Did you think I was someone you could use?" David said, watching Falcone's pale face. "He's yours." He hadn't forgotten the old man's suppressed excitement when he pointed out Avery's location, the way Falcone had hoped to sit and watch the tigers fight while someone else did the killing. David hauled Avery away. The gangsters who had been thrown by the shockwave staggered up, wounded to differing degrees, but none dared stand in David's path. They parted for him like parting water, fearful of offending a force they could not comprehend. Batman watched David go, frowning. He didn't stop him, partly because he had no confidence he could, and partly because he rarely interfered in what others did, provided they didn't cross his moral line. David's eyes had been brutal and contemptuous, looking at others like insects or slaves. Batman didn't believe the man he carried away was an innocent neighborly type who liked to help old ladies cross the street. Still, even if he disliked David's methods, Batman held to his no-kill rule. That night, David didn't return to Smallville. He stayed another night in Gotham. The next morning, he pulled open the heavy hotel curtains to another overcast sky. Rain trickled down the glass like tears. The weather in Gotham always pressed on him, a perpetual gray that made even small comforts feel heavy. He opened the wardrobe and dragged out the unconscious Avery, shoved into it like luggage. Problem solved, he thought. Time to go home to Smallville. As he geared up, his phone rang. "David?" Clark's voice on the line trembled. "It's bad. Dad collapsed. He's unconscious in the hospital." David felt the blood drain from his face. Jonathan had always been a sturdy man who kept working long after others would stop. The word kryptonite flashed through his mind, prolonged exposure could cause terrible illnesses, but the family had always kept any meteor fragments locked away in lead. There should be no reason for this. "What happened?" David demanded. Clark sounded panicked. "Last night, Dad came home and said he'd helped someone on the road. He was fine then, but this morning he felt off. He's emotionally unstable sometimes, crying and laughing, but then he fainted in the barn and is in a coma. The hospital can't find what's wrong." "What's his diagnosis?" David asked, voice tight. "I don't know. They're running tests, but nothing shows up. But do you remember Kira, the new transfer student?" David's jaw tightened. Kira, Nama, was someone they knew in Smallville. Clark's anxiety deepened. "What about her?" Clark lowered his voice. "She heard about Dad and came to the hospital. She says Dad was poisoned by something called a devil flower." "Kira? Poisoned?" David's tone was hard as stone. He wanted to believe it was an accident, but his parents were on the line. Kira stepped closer to the phone, pressing it to her ear so she could talk to him. "David," Kira said quickly, eyes worried, "your father was poisoned by a devil flower." She moved to one side of the corridor to speak quietly. "I rushed to the hospital when I heard. The person your father helped is here too. Same symptoms, a persistent high fever. I went to the road where it happened and found devil flowers growing there." "Devil flower?" David's anger flared. If someone had left poisonous blooms on the road for people to find, it wasn't an accident. Kira told him what the Smallville elders had always warned. The devil flower was a poisonous plant discovered centuries ago in the wastelands outside town. Its scent would make people cry or laugh, become agitated as if possessed, and then, shortly after, collapse and die. They called it the devil flower because after a brief madness, people would die, she said quietly, watching Jonathan's motionless figure through the hospital glass. Back then, people burned every devil flower they found. The plant needs harsh conditions to grow. It was thought extinct for hundreds of years. Smallville Hospital has no experience with this. Those poisoned rarely live more than a day. "Modern medicine can't cure it?" David asked, because the alternative, losing his father, was unbearable. Kira shook her head. "Our tribe are descendants of people from beyond this world, but we don't have magic or advanced tech. We remember the old remedies, but the flower's toxin, it's something primitive and cruel. I don't know of a cure." David bristled at the helplessness in her voice, but didn't dismiss her outright. He had no intention of leaving any possibility unexplored where his parents were concerned. "Is there any way, anything at all? An antidote? Ritual? Something from your elders?" "I'm sorry," Kira said. "I wish I could say yes. I don't have a way." Clark's voice broke. "David, what did she tell you? Can you do anything?" David swallowed hard. He could picture his mother's face, Jonathan's quiet steadiness. "Comfort, Mom," he said as firmly as he could. "Don't give up. I'll be back as soon as I can." He took a breath. "I found Avery. I'm in Gotham now. I'll come home immediately." They ended the call, but David's mind raced. Even if modern medicine couldn't handle a poison that had been extinct for centuries, this world had strange possibilities, miracles he had seen before. He knew, too, that there were at least 2 leads right here in Gotham that might help him save Jonathan. Chapter 62, L.S. Roadpool. The Court of Owls, which secretly rules Gotham, made immortal enforcers called Talons by using a miraculous metal called Electrum. David's eyes flickered. Electrum could revive people, dramatically increase strength and agility, and grant a kind of immortality, but it worked far too slowly. It had to be implanted and spend years fusing with a body's blood and cells, while the corpse stayed preserved before revival was possible. The process was only a last resort. There was, however, another option, the Lazarus Pit. He scooped up the pale, unconscious Avery and prepared to go back to the small town to check on his father. He wouldn't be able to rest otherwise. He'd have to return to Gotham soon, too, but for him the trip between the 2 cities was only a few minutes. For ordinary people, it was hours. For him, it was no farther than a trip to the supermarket. Breaking the sound barrier, he left the hotel in a boom and arrived at Smallville Hospital in less than 3 minutes. After leaving the man on the rooftop, he found his parents' room. The door creaked open. "David." Martha had been sitting by Jonathan's bed, holding his calloused hand and fighting tears. Seeing her younger son return after several days, she couldn't hold back her voice, trembling with relief. David. He hugged her, then looked down at his father. Jonathan, always optimistic, stubborn, and strong as an ox, lay on the bed with lips drained of color and a high fever clouding his mind. The hospital had just confirmed he'd been poisoned by an unknown, highly toxic substance and was expected to be critical within a day. Martha stroked his face and, between sobs, tried to hold on to memories. "Children," she said, forcing a smile as if to steady herself. "Have I told you about the first time your father and I met? He was at Metropolis University, sitting by a fountain in Denham, eating an apple. I asked him for his notes, even though I already had my own. I always imagined walking down the aisle with him. I never thought about how our last meeting would be." "It'll be okay, Mom. I already have a way to cure Dad," David said gently, pressing her shoulder. He glanced toward Clark and Kira in the room. Kira's face brightened at the mention of a solution. Seeing joy rather than tension on her face, David quietly concluded she hadn't poisoned Jonathan and that his earlier suspicions were wrong. "Is there really a way, son?" Martha asked, doubt and hope mingling in her voice. "There's a spring in the world called the Lazarus Pit," David said. "Its water can heal injuries, restore youth, even bring people back from the dead." Clark listened and, skeptical, said, "That sounds like a legend. You sure you're not making this up to comfort us?" David let him finish. "There are more wonders in the world than people admit. Someone discovered that spring and named it after the biblical Lazarus because of what it did. But there's a catch. The water has side effects. Overuse, or the wrong use, can deepen a person's darker impulses. We don't need resurrection, just enough of the water to neutralize the toxin before it does irreversible damage. We have to get the spring water here fast." There was a cold glint in his eyes. Using the Lazarus Pit to heal was risky, but a measured use to flush the poison should be tolerable. "Kira, thank you for coming so quickly," he said. "Please stay with my mother. Clark and I will be back before dark." Kira nodded. She truly wanted to help their family. "Be careful," she whispered. David hauled Avery down from the rooftop, and together he and Clark left the hospital. They stopped at a power plant on the outskirts of town. "Saving Dad this time will depend on your speed," David said after they arrived. "My speed?" Clark blinked. He'd been left in the dark about the plan and felt both anxious and useless. He would have given up his powers permanently to save their father, and David's casual confidence made him uneasy. Avery lay on the concrete, pale and motionless. Clark frowned. He'd seen this before and didn't like the look of it. "What's wrong with him?" "He was wearing that kryptonite ring too long and passed out," David said. He handed Clark Avery's hand for a moment, then ripped a high-voltage cable loose from nearby equipment and handed one end to Clark. Clark barely had time to register the glitter of sparks. Before he could protest, David wound the live cable around Avery and then touched the other end to Clark. The line arced. The kryptonite ring on Avery flared bright green, and the visible current took on an eerie green hue. Clark screamed as electric energy tore through him, his muscles convulsing. When the scream cut off, Clark's eyes flew open. Strength flooded back into him, raw and overwhelming. He dropped the cable and stared at his hands in astonishment. Regaining his powers had always been profound, but never this sudden and visceral. David took the kryptonite ring off Avery and pocketed it, patting Clark on the shoulder. "I told you to believe in yourself." He grinned, teasing. "You've got real potential." Clark, breathing hard, managed, "You were reckless. That could have killed me." "Maybe," David admitted lightly, "but it worked." Suddenly, Avery sat bolt upright. Pain ripped across his chest and face as if his heart were being roasted alive. He couldn't think. His blood raced like a tide out of control. "Avery, what's wrong?" Clark demanded. Avery couldn't answer. His veins bulged. His head throbbed. He coughed violently and spit up blood, then crumpled to the ground, breath gone. Silence fell. Clark stared in horror. David's expression hardened. He crouched beside the dead man and checked for any faint sign of life, then looked up. "Don't blame me for everything," he said coldly. "I didn't kill him." Clark could only look at the body and at the glowing kryptonite ring David had removed. David offered a grim hypothesis. "There may have been a little solar energy left in his cells from when your power flavored his metabolism. Without a Kryptonian physique to handle that energy, it would have burned him out." "Then what do we do now?" Clark asked, voice raw. David stood. We go to Gotham. There's someone there who should be able to tell us exactly where the Lazarus Pit is. Withered branches, like gray, bony hands, crawled over the courtyard wall. Hair-raising screams echoed from inside the building. The paint, eaten away by wind and rain, was mottled and peeling, like a grotesque, decaying painting. From the exterior to the interior, the place exuded a sinister, oppressive air. This was one of Gotham's oldest institutions, Arkham Asylum. It was both hospital and prison, full of mentally ill criminals. Gotham felt cursed. Deranged offenders seemed as common here as pickpockets elsewhere. Inside Arkham, Batman crouched in the shadows by a railing near the ceiling, his cold eyes fixed below. He had come from the docks following a lead about a large shipment of chemical raw materials. At first, he'd thought someone was producing a white powder potent enough to ruin thousands of lives, but the reality was different. The storeroom beneath him had been turned into a pharmaceutical-style factory. Men in lab suits were mixing barrels of powder under fluorescent lights. Under the supervision of a thin, slightly stooped man in a white coat, the finished product was being funneled into the city's water mains that ran through the asylum. The overseer looked like a scarecrow in more civilized clothes, refined, bespectacled, but with madness shadowing his brow. His name tag read Jonathan Klein, his title, attending physician. Batman frowned. This doctor wasn't content with an ordinary caseload of the insane he'd taken to other enterprises. Batman's gaze tracked the thick accumulation of spilled medicine around the pipes. This operation's been going on for days, he thought. Someone is poisoning the water supply, he wondered. He had drunk Gotham's tap water earlier and felt nothing wrong. He was about to drop down and put a stop to it, grab the pale doctor with a grappling hook and drag him in for interrogation, when a message pinged in his cowl. Alfred? Young master, Alfred said briskly over the comm. Someone has come to visit. Your bat mask may have been exposed. You should return home. Batman hesitated. With the roar of water in the pipes as cover, he pried a smear of the spilled medicine from the corner of a wall with his grappling hook, quickly retracted it, and melted back into the shadows. After the death of his parents, Alfred had raised Bruce. Alfred was the last of his family. He rode the Bat motorcycle hard for Wayne Manor. A few minutes earlier, on the streets of Gotham, everyone had something new to talk about. Falcone, the city's old godfather, had been stripped to his underwear, lashed to the bat signal, and projected into the always cloudy sky. The bat had humiliated him. For years, Falcone's fearsome reputation had held sway. Now it lay in tatters. The whole city felt something could be changing. Thugs and petty criminals, used to operating with grim certainty, were suddenly panicked, committing crimes with a jittery, disorganized edge. At any moment, they imagined, a monstrous shadow might drop from above and swallow them whole. A newspaper, blown by the wind, slapped a newcomer in the face. Clark wiped the paper away and read the bold red headline, "Under the Bat Signal, Falcone Captured." The page showed a photo of the scene and a sketch of Batman streaking between tall buildings, his cape spread into a winged silhouette. Clark paused. The outline seemed familiar. Could this be the person who knew the whereabouts of the Lazarus Pit? He turned to the companion at his side and found a young man he recognized. David had the same height and build, Clark remembered. He'd recently regained his normal appearance in the small town. Now in Gotham, he wasn't trying to hide. "Why are you wearing David's clothes?" someone asked, confused, and Clark heard himself respond to the question he'd been asked. "Where's your blue cowl?" "David?" Clark said, surprised. "How did you change into this? Is that one of your abilities?" Hearing the familiar voice and seeing the familiar stature, Clark realized at once that this was his younger brother. At David's instruction, Clark pulled a blue cowl from his bag and put it on. "Where do we find Batman now?" he asked. "Creatures like the bat are active at night and rest during the day," David replied after a moment's thought. "He's probably home now. Let's go check his house." Night was Batman's domain, but even the Dark Knight needed to return somewhere safe to rest. The two of them streaked across the city at near supersonic speed and came to a stop at Wayne Manor on the outskirts of Gotham. Green lawns, vines crawling up the walls, an imposing iron gate, a long avenue of statues, and an ancient brooding mansion behind a fountain. The place looked like a fortress and a museum rolled together. "What a huge estate," Clark said, awed. "Rex's place doesn't come close." "Does Batman live here?" Clark asked. "What exactly can he do?" "You've already seen him," David said. "You mean you've seen him?" Clark looked puzzled. All he'd seen so far was an old manor and a headline. David didn't try to trespass outright. He pressed the doorbell. A palm-sized screen embedded in the stone pillar flickered to life and showed an elderly man with the precise bearing of an English butler. "May I ask who is calling?" his voice asked politely. "Is Bruce Wayne home?" David asked. "I'm sorry, Master is not home at the moment. Please call again. May I leave a message?" Alfred replied in the prescribed tone. "Is Batman here?" David asked instead of answering Alfred's formality. Alfred recognized David at a glance, but kept his composure. He'd once seen David's face on a Batcave screen. He'd watched footage of the way David's fingers could flare with light and dispatch robbers with eerie efficiency. Still, the butler's answer was steady. "This is Wayne Manor. The person you seek is not here." David's expression hardened, then he severed the connection with a curt apology. Clark scratched at his jaw. They'd been turned away, and they needed answers. Should they force their way in? "No matter," David said finally. "We can wait. That certain bat will be rushing back soon enough." Instead of lingering at the gate, David slipped past the ironwork and pulled Clark with him into the grounds. They moved like shadows between statuary and clipped hedges. At nearly the same moment, Batman's motorcycle tore back into the manor grounds. He slipped up the mansion's flank like a thief, fired a grappling hook, and swung himself onto the second-floor ledge. He peered in through a living room window. Inside, Alfred was entertaining two guests on the sofa. One of them wasn't drinking his coffee. His fingers drummed the armrest, restless and impatient. Batman watched them for a long beat in the gloom, thinking to himself, "Has that predator not left Gotham yet? What could be making him so anxious?" Chapter 64. Everything Comes in Time. In the parlor, another man sat stiffly and shyly, his face hidden by a blue hood, while he clutched a steaming cup of coffee. He looked embarrassed to have intruded on someone's home and grateful for Alfred's courtesy, apologizing to the butler again and again. Batman, having changed out of his cowl and into civilian clothes, returned quietly to the second-floor parlor and pushed the door open. He nodded at Alfred and stepped inside. After watching what David had done with a single energy-filled punch, Bruce no longer suspected some hidden gadget. If current technology could produce that kind of power, Wayne Enterprises would have been obsolete long ago. "You're too slow," David said, standing and frowning. He'd noticed Bruce peering in through the window earlier, but hadn't exposed him. He had already broken into someone else's house, and dragging him in from outside would have been rude. "Mr. Bruce Wayne, can you tell me where the Lazarus Pit is?" "The what?" Bruce frowned. He'd never heard that name. David's next question followed quickly. "Where in the Middle East is the League of Assassins headquarters where you trained?" "Trained? League of Assassins?" Bruce began, then corrected himself. "I've only heard of the League of Shadows." At the mention of Ra's al Ghul and the League, the hooded man's impatience sharpened. The name struck a chord. Ra's al Ghul, the so-called Demon's Head, founder of the League, who had discovered the Lazarus Pit in the Middle East and used it to extend his life for centuries. He'd amassed wealth, built secretive organizations around the globe, and dedicated himself to purifying the world. The Shadows might be another branch of the same movement. Clark, standing nearby and studying both men, listened as a string of names and implications snapped into place in his mind. He glanced from David to Bruce. How did his brother know so much? There wasn't time to unpack that now. "Please tell us, Mr. Wayne. This is important." Bruce had just heard the name Ra's al Ghul for the first time, and the mention pulled at a memory. He looked from Clark to David, weighing what to say. The man in the blue hood didn't look like someone of wealth or influence. His clothes were simple, the fabric rough, a faint hay smell clinging to him. And yet he addressed David as if they were equals. Did he possess that same power? Bruce's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden image that flashed into his head. Gotham's harbor, cold and damp, waves smashing against the rocks, a freighter at the dock. From it, a tall, well-groomed man stepped down, middle-aged with a neat beard and short, silvered hair, eyes bright with determination, dressed in a custom suit that spoke of wealth and command. Masked, warrior-clad followers filed behind him like a cult, silent and deadly. Men hauled a massive machine from the ship, the war machine Wayne Enterprises had lost. "Let us destroy it," the leader had said coldly, eyes on the city, like Rome and London before them. Bruce blinked and forced himself back to the present. He'd indeed trained somewhere, but not with the league he'd just heard named. He chose his words carefully. Where exactly? David didn't hesitate. He already knew the location and planned to go with Clark as soon as he had specifics. "If you're looking for Ra's al Ghul, I killed him there by accident." Bruce's eyes flickered with the memory. He recalled a bald, monk-like man whose swordsmanship had given him trouble. When Bruce had forced that leader to move the Shadow's forces toward destroying Gotham, Bruce had set a great fire. Explosives had detonated and buried that man beneath the blaze. Only Bruce's own mentor, the man who had taught him and whom Bruce had once saved, had survived. "That can't be," Bruce said. "Ra's al Ghul wouldn't stay dead. He has the Lazarus Pit. Even if you killed him, his followers would throw him into the pit to bring him back." David's voice was low and certain. "Even if he did, that's still a way to find him. If we find Ra's al Ghul, we find where the Lazarus Pit is." The notion hit a chord in Bruce. Over the past 2 days, he had been chasing another thread. Wayne Enterprises had lost a microwave emitter capable of vaporizing water sources, a weapon with clear military applications. Then he discovered that someone had been putting unknown chemicals into the city's water pipes. Putting these together didn't take long. "If the League of Shadows is still active," Bruce said, his face hardening, "they could be planning to make that poison spread through vaporized water. They could destroy Gotham by turning its own water into a weapon. The microwave emitter went missing, and now the city's pipes are being contaminated. These things aren't unrelated. They might strike at any time," Clark added. "Tomorrow, or even sooner." David raised an eyebrow and looked over at Clark. He'd thought this line of inquiry might end at Batman, but Bruce's doubts had reopened the trail. "Ra's is arrogant," David said. "He's lived too long to hide when he's about to make his play. He'll go with his warriors and ninjas out in the open." "Hundreds of years?" Bruce's eyebrow twitched. If someone had told him a man had lived for centuries, he'd have laughed before tonight. After watching what David could do, immortality sounded less impossible. Clark didn't hesitate. Without asking where David had learned any of this, he concentrated, created a gust of wind, and vanished from the room in an instant. Bruce watched the place where Clark had stood until the air stilled. "He's gone to search the city, to root Ra's out." David peered at the clock and then out the window. It was only around 9. There was still time. If they could find Ra's al Ghul and force him to reveal the Lazarus Pit's location, they could go to the spring and secure the water before it was weaponized. Using his supervision, Clark swept across Gotham at many times the speed of sound, hunting for the samurai and ninja-clad figures David had mentioned. He was afraid of missing a single block, a single alley. Enveloped in his bioelectric aura, he moved through crowds without causing a single window to shatter or a single pedestrian to stumble. People on the street had no idea someone was passing among them at such a terrible speed. After more than 10 minutes of relentless searching, Clark finally found them at the elevated train station. In a flash, he was behind the crowd. On the platform, nearly 100 people stood in uncanny formation, gas masks over their faces, katanas slung across their backs, dressed like samurai. They exuded a mechanical coldness that made bystanders instinctively step away. Strangers in bizarre attire scattered in fear. Even when the train pulled in, no one would board where they were standing. At their head was a middle-aged man in a suit, leaning on a cane with the smooth, terrible grace of a ruler. The men behind him, like silent attendants, carried a large, boxy machine onto the train. That leader's presence sent something through Clark's bones. Ra's al Ghul, the name David had warned about. Clark thumbed a number and called for backup. At the same time, in the Batcave, Bruce had been running a different line of inquiry. He'd mixed the powdered sample recovered from the League into water and allowed it to evaporate under controlled heat. Inside a glass chamber, a few test bats, real bats kept for analysis, went hysterical. Fear turned to rage. They attacked one another savagely. Blood and torn flesh flew. Within half a minute, they were near death. Bruce clenched his fists as he watched. The result was unmistakable. The League's plan was to turn fear into physical violence, to let panic breed bloodshed. If a handful of bats could do this to each other, Gotham's millions exposed to the same influence would be a massacre. There was only one emitter, and replicating it would take time. The only plausible vector was mobility, someone moving that emitter through the city to spread the effect, then watching the city burn from a distance. He paged the team with a lead. Found them. North Side Elevated Station. David answered instantly. Seconds later, he was gone. Back at the station, Clark acted without hesitation. He tore the steel rails of the elevated line apart with a single violent tug. The tracks scraped and groaned and then split. The train could go nowhere. On the platform, the samurai did not flinch. Ra's al Ghul's face was cold as marble, a monarch's fury simmering beneath the surface. He had the air of someone who had lived for centuries and commanded life and death as if they were tools. The samurai drew their katanas as one, blades flashing. Panic erupted on the platform. People screamed and scrambled for the exits. David, alloy-bodied and compact as a battering ram, vanished from the edge of the crowd and cannoned into the train like a projectile. The thin metal wall tore open. Glass exploded inward like rain. 1 instant later, he was inside, steel limbs smacking a dozen of the samurai aside. "Where is the Lazarus Pit, Ra's al Ghul?" he demanded. Raz's pupils narrowed, surprise flickering over a face that had seen the collapse of empires. "Kill them," he ordered. The samurai charged with a howl. David didn't bother looking. He stomped, sending a concussive shock through the car that hurled attackers through the windows like rag dolls. Some slumped, bleeding. Others, apparently unnerved by no pain, picked themselves up and came back with swords held high. Clark moved through the door, sweeping the interior with careful non-lethal force. He knocked men down, creating space. "How do you know that name?" he asked David, voice tense and urgent. The battle around them continued to rage. Raz, his men taking casualties, did not show alarm. He drew a blade from his cane and flicked it with the cold precision of a master. The sword flashed toward David's neck like lightning. The moment the blade touched David's alloy skin, it shattered. The hilt was wrenched from Raz's hand. Raz's right hand came away injured, blood leaking between fingers where the sword had resisted. In a heartbeat, David closed the distance. He grabbed Raz by the throat with one iron hand and lifted. The old man dangled, staring up at the young man who held him. David's voice was a flat, deadly thing. "In combat, you might be one of the strongest on this planet," he said. "But in front of me, you're nothing but a writhing insect." Ra's al Ghul's life had been lengthened and hardened by the Lazarus Pit, yet in this moment he was simply mortal. Even so, his face did not show fear. He sneered. "Is that so? The demon's head is never threatened by anyone." His words were defiance more than denial. Raz had seen centuries. He'd soaked himself in the pit until compassion and sentiment were strange luxuries. But David's grip tightened, and for the first time, Raz showed an emotion that wasn't a practiced coldness. David's eyes went harder. He knew the old man could not be treated like any other enemy. He knew the stories. The man who'd learned alchemy and medicine, traveled the world, and found the Lazarus Pit in Arabia. He knew the story of Sora, the woman Raz had loved, who'd been killed by a resurrected prince, and how that betrayal poisoned him into founding the League of Assassins. "You loved your wife," David said quietly. "You loved her until she was taken from you. After that, you became what you are." The name of that old wound brought a flash of rage across Raz's face. He lunged, throwing a punch, but David slapped him back to the floor. Blood leaked from the corner of Raz's mouth. David leaned closer, the inferno in his voice barely contained. "I know you have a daughter, Talia, the thing you love most." The name hit Raz like a physical blow. For the first time in the confrontation, panic creased his eyes. David's hold was relentless. "Tell me where the Lazarus Pit is," he said, "or you will taste losing a loved one all over again." Clark's jaw tightened. The change in David's demeanor, so cold, so personal, alarmed him. He'd seen David be ruthless, but never without a moral line. Yet David wasn't speaking about innocence. Talia al Ghul was a high-ranking member of the League. She bore blood on her hands. "I won't harm her," Clark said quickly, sharp with warning. "Don't make threats you can't back up." David ignored him. He raised his palm and unleashed a focused energy blast. It punched through the floor of the train car, burning a bowl-sized hole that melted iron and turned trackbed to incandescent slag. Molten metal dripped and flowed. The heat carved a darker, deeper well into the ground below, 10 meters and beyond, as if the earth itself had been gouged out. The smell of sulfur rolled up in a heat wave that singed hair. Ra's al Ghul's expression went from defiant to terrified in a heartbeat as he felt that infernal heat. David's voice came low and inexorable. "If you won't tell me, then even if you have the Lazarus Pit, you will be as powerless as when Sora died." For all his centuries of command, Ra's felt the old dread. The thing he loved most could be taken from him again. Around them, the samurai regrouped, but the momentum had shifted. Clark moved to restrain David, hands on the young man's shoulders, voice steadying but urgent. David's face was ice. "Where is it?" he repeated. Ra's, throat bruised, eyes flicking between the two, understood that he was facing someone who didn't bluff. The old calculus of power and immortality meant less here than the immediate peril to the one person he could not afford to lose. He spat a word of contempt, and then, after a ragged pause that sounded like a surrender, he said, "You will not find it." The lie was thin, his voice trembled. David's grip tightened. "You'd better say where it is," he said. "I don't ask twice." The train platform had emptied, except for the armored samurai who still answered to Ra's and the three who now stood above them. David, Clark, and the ancient assassin whose life had been coated in blood and grief. Gotham's night buzzed around them, the city's lights indifferent to the drama on that station. Ra's swallowed. For a man who'd believed himself untouchable, for a man who'd eradicated kingdoms and outlived them all, this threat looked different, raw, immediate, personal. He met David's stare, the old lines around his mouth hardening into something like resignation. "All places die," he said finally, voice low. "Everything, even the pit, has its keepers." David's expression didn't change. The threat of Talia's disappearance hung in the air, a blade poised to fall. Clark put himself between them, feeling the strain of both men's determination like a pressure against his chest. If Ra's lied, if this was a trap meant to bait them into destroying what remained of the city, the consequences would be catastrophic. If he told the truth, then Gotham still had a chance. The samurai's katanas glinted in the heat haze. Somewhere deep underfoot, molten metal frothed. Above them, the city throbbed with the quiet, ignorant life of millions whose fates might depend on the answer to a single terrible question: where lay the Lazarus Pit? "Enough. You want the Lazarus Pit, and I'll give it to you." Ra's al Ghul, who had just declared that the demon's head never bows to threats, spoke the words with a reluctant edge of fear. "Don't you dare threaten me with Talia." The man before him possessed terrifying power. Raz's warriors and ninjas had been helpless against him. This was an enemy unlike any he had met. He cared about few things in the world, but an unfamiliar tide of unease washed over him now. He wasn't confident he could protect his daughter from this man's murderous intent. "There is a Lazarus Pit deep in the Rocky Mountains. You can have what you want there." Humiliated, Raz rattled off coordinates. There were multiple Lazarus Pits on Earth. He had sought them out and established bases around them. He would never reveal the location of the League of Assassins' headquarters, but he would give the location of a pit. "Take him, Clark. We're leaving." David, unwilling to trust him, tossed Raz to Clark. He wasn't fixated on the Lazarus Pit in the Middle East. Any restorative water would do. A closer source meant getting the water sooner, and his father Jonathan would suffer less. "Where are you taking him?" A shadow cut through the dome overhead as Batman broke through, wings spread, descending. His deep voice echoed. He looked at the disheveled Raz with a complex expression. "I think you are the true demon's head." Raz had been his mentor when he trained with the League of Shadows. He had taught him many things, including the art of hiding behind a mask, of becoming an unfathomable monster to inspire fear. At the time, they had been teacher and friend. The demon's head in the monk's robes was just a puppet you put forward. No, when I'm not present, he truly is the demon's head. Raz regarded his most accomplished disciple and sighed. From the familiar lower half of the man's face, he had already recognized his former pupil. He had long suspected who the Batman in Gotham was. You followed my lessons well. Hide your weakness behind a mask. Enough. Our talk ends here. If he hasn't lied to me, I'll spare him and bring him back for you. David, anxious to get on, frowned. He didn't want the two to linger in reminiscence. Batman had given them a lead. With it, David and Clark vanished, taking Ra's al Ghul toward the Rocky Mountains. The Rocky Mountains run like a spine down North America, thousands of kilometers of named and unnamed ranges. On an unnamed spur, above 2,000 meters where the air was thin, stood a stone palace at a snow-capped summit. With a gust of wind spinning snow behind them, David and Clark appeared carrying Ra's. We're here. I see a pool at the base of the palace, Clark said, his X-ray vision revealing a recessed pool area guarded by many figures. Relief swelled in him. Once he had the water, he could rush back and save his father. But a pool didn't guarantee anything. David wasn't naive. You better not be lying about this, or you can start preparing a coffin for your daughter, David warned Ra's. Ninjas in dark garb leaped from the palace, surrounding them as if confronting a great threat. David's eyes flicked to tiny cameras hidden in the tall snow pines, then away. This place of yours is well equipped. All of you, stand down, Ra's al Ghul ordered, still shaken. He couldn't fathom how these two had transported him from Gotham to the Rockies, thousands of kilometers, in less than half an hour at speeds beyond sound. One extraordinary being would be astonishing. Two defied everything he'd seen. What are you? I've encountered many wonders in my travels, but never beings like you. You don't need to know, David replied. Ignoring the ninjas, who holstered their weapons but watched hungrily, David and Clark led Ra's into the palace's depths. Beyond stone doors was a cavernous chamber, and at its heart, an emerald-green pool. Under the dim light, the water made Clark's face look sickly green. He didn't like the color and instinctively felt unease. Is this really the pool you spoke of? He asked. It didn't look like a holy spring. It looked corrupt. Is this the Lazarus pit? Clark asked. David frowned. This was his first time seeing a rumored resurrection spring. He dipped a hand into the water to test it. It's not a cure-all for free. The Lazarus pit can heal wounds, restore life, even grant a kind of immortality, but used too much it demands a price. It warps the mind. Good men go in and something else can come out. Raz sneered, looking at his reflection in the green surface. He knew the pit's corrosive influence on the psyche, but he insisted he had not been changed. Everything had been his choice. Clark, surprised, David hadn't warned him of this, snapped, no more of that. Heeding his brother, Clark took a water bag and filled it, half the size of a human. David shook the water from his hand and felt nothing energy-wise. Too much of this water can still poison or kill, he said. Legends varied. Some said a Dionysus factor, an impure liquid metal of rebirth, was behind the pit's power. Others blamed magic. I don't know about other pits, but this one seems tied to the Dionysus factor. Staring at the emerald basin, an idea struck him. His energy manipulation wasn't at its peak, and he still couldn't absorb magical energy, but his sensitivity to energy was unrivaled. Maybe it awakens the worst in people. But without controlling dosage, it was a gamble. Even a short exposure had turned some into deranged caricatures. Clark hesitated, then decided this was better than letting their father die. Anyway, it's better than Dad dying from the poison. Once the bag was filled, David said, "We can go back now." Clark glanced at Ra's. David had told him to keep the blue cowl on to hide his identity. Clark had not used names or said he was saving his own father. Wait! With the pit as insurance, David dared something bold. He fired eye-beams into the water. The emerald pool began to boil and evaporate at once. "What are you doing? Are you going to destroy it?" Ra's cried. Light flooded the dark chamber. Raz's face twisted in horror. He had revealed one of his pits under duress, and now it was being destroyed before him. He did nothing but watch. "If you don't want to be buried here, shut your mouth," David snapped. His eyes poured out cosmic energy, heating the pool until it flashed to steam. David wanted the pure Dionysus factor. If he could extract the pure metal, his father's recovery would be safer. He also wanted to prevent this from ever happening again. The pool, dozens of meters across, vaporized in moments, leaving molten earth and rock, a churning magma lake. the chamber filled with a sulfurous stench. David intensified his output. The thin mountain air made breathing hard. Raz could not remain and fled as heat rose to intolerable levels. At the bottom, magma boiled. David's focal energy reached beyond 10,000 degrees. He claimed it exceeded the sun's surface temperature and kept climbing. The heat was unbearable to everyone but Clark. Still no metal was visible. David frowned. Is the Dionysus factor too scarce to form, or has it sunk to the bottom of the magma? Just as doubt crept in, emerald droplets began to gather above the magma. They coalesced into a thumb-sized pool of reflective green liquid metal that floated on the molten sea like oil on water. David's face lit up. He ran across the magma as if it were solid ground. His speed made the lava feel like firm earth under his feet. He grabbed the deep green metal and came back. The liquid seemed to try to fuse with him. David reacted quickly, cutting a stone test tube with an energy ray, placing the metal inside and sealing it. No leakage. Is this what you wanted, David? Clark asked, puzzled as he examined the test tube. To use this to save Father, David said, eyes bright with determination. It'll be safer with the Dionysus factor. He tucked the test tube away. Now we should go back. Author's note. Today I updated nearly 6,000 characters split across 2 chapters. I saw comments accusing me of shamelessly charging for 3,000 character chapters. I didn't label them that way to brag. I labeled them because some readers new to Chidion don't realize chapter prices are based on word count and might mistakenly think I unilaterally raised the price. I don't have that authority, nor do other authors on the site. As for updates, I'm a slow writer and do my best. I can normally manage about 6,000 characters a day, sometimes pushing to 8,000. I wish I could write tens of thousands a day, like some others. Of course I would. The limitation is my typing speed. Thank you to all readers for your support. I'll keep doing my best. Chapter 67. Haven't you noticed? He had captured Ra's al Ghul as the man tried to escape by helicopter and deposited him at Wayne Manor in Gotham. How Bruce decided to handle his former father-in-law was Bruce's business. David and Clark raced back to Smallville Hospital. With the Dionysus factor, there was no medical need to panic, even if Jonathan died. But how could they let Martha face unbearable grief? Mom, we're back. They pushed into the ward. The clock on the wall said noon. Clark kept watch at the door, then locked it and drew the curtains. Whatever they were about to do was not something ordinary people should see. Is that the spring water that detoxifies him? Martha, eyes red from crying, rose from the bedside and looked at the stone vial David held with a tremor of hope. Pretty much, Mom. David looked down at his unconscious father. He'll wake up soon, strong as ever, like nothing happened. He glanced at Kira but didn't send her away. Walking to Jonathan's side, he laid a hand on his father's fevered brow and tipped the vial. The dark, metallic emerald liquid beaded and dripped onto Jonathan's skin. David stopped after half, keeping the rest for Martha. He wanted to see the effect first. If needed, he could use the remainder. The liquid seemed to seep in like spring water into dry soil. Kira watched, mouth slightly open. If this wasn't a miracle, it was very close. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Several tense heartbeats passed. Then Jonathan inhaled sharply, as if surfacing from a suffocating river. He opened his eyes, blinked, and sat bolt upright. The heart monitor stuttered into life. The antiseptic tang of the ward filled the air. His wife and 2 sons crowded the bed, hope written on their faces, along with an unfamiliar young woman. Hiss! Where am I? He rubbed his head, dazed, as if waking from a very long sleep. Jonathan, do you feel anything wrong? Martha asked, tears now of joy. Wrong? He looked between them, confused. When he moved his arm, the expression on his face shifted. It feels a little off. Could there still be poison left? Was the Dionysus factor insufficient? David reached for the reserved portion but stopped. Jonathan's tone lightened. Since I turned 30, I never felt so young. I could go work for old Byrne at the ranch right now. Jonathan flexed his fingers. Energy radiated from him. You scared me to death, Jonathan, Martha scolded, slapping his shoulder half-heartedly. Relief and reproach mingled. Don't do that. Clark grinned and slapped his brother's shoulder. Mom, you should still get Dad checked out, just in case. David let out a private breath, a small smile carving his face, but he kept his voice careful. As far as the hospital knew, the story would be that the indigenous tribe had a hidden antidote, the Dionysus factor, he hoped would remain undetectable by normal science. Jonathan, now closer to himself, looked at Kira and blinked. By the way, who is this girl? He glanced at his sons. The near sameness in their ages made him curious, as if they might have been friends for years. After the doctors checked him over, they found Jonathan's body astonishingly healthy, like a man in his 30s. One surprised physician, hearing about the detoxifying herb, asked for a sample for study. David refused flatly, invoking tribal rules that forbade taking it outside. Jonathan and Martha left the hospital that day, discharged and heading home to prepare the evening meal. Kira helped pack their things, and in gratitude they invited her to dinner. She accepted, an opportunity to get closer to Nama's parents, and then left. David and Clark lingered by another ward's glass pane. Inside, a middle-aged man's heart had suddenly failed. A doctor and nurses worked frantically. The defibrillator popped and screamed, but the patient's heart would not hold. David, Clark started, but then stopped. He could guess what his brother wanted. Don't even think about it. David's refusal was instant, firm. The rest of the spring water is for Mom. Clark fell silent. Kira, meanwhile, had been investigating the return of the so-called devil flower, extinct for a century, and had also traced the identity of the man in the ambulance. He had once been a scientist expelled from the mainstream for publishing theories that others called lunatic. According to her, he had come back to prove himself, to redeem his reputation through work. David looked through the glass at the body, his gaze cold. He had no business dragging my family into this, he said quietly. I won't touch him, but I sure as hell won't save him either. Clark's helplessness was plain. If something didn't use the antidote, the man would die. A nurse finished covering the still form with a white sheet. The doctor stepped back and pronounced time of death. What a pity, a brilliant mind gone, a voice said behind them. They turned. Lex Luthor, wearing an expensive suit and a look of genuine regret, had been standing in the corridor. He peered at the bed for a long moment. Lex, what are you doing here? Clark asked. Luthor nodded toward the covered body. I wanted to see him before I left town. I missed him. He had sent people to investigate the town's odd stories and discovered that a once notable scientist, Dr. Hamilton, had been living out here in a camper, studying meteorites. His paper on meteorites and genetic mutation fit Luthor's own speculations. The meteor shower was the origin of Smallville's strange occurrences. A nurse recorded the pronouncement. 3:46 p.m., patient pronounced dead after failed resuscitation. She left. Luthor lingered a moment longer, then tilted his head slightly toward David. 1 step ahead is a genius. 10 steps ahead is a madman. Dr. Hamilton thought the same, he said softly, as if to himself. Then, more directly to the boys. You grew up here. Haven't you noticed the strange things that started appearing after the meteor shower? Chapter 68. Wishing Stone. What small town with any history doesn't have a few ghost stories? Clark scratched the back of his neck and chuckled. That strange meteor shower probably gave people something to build ghost stories around. Perhaps. Lex Luthor didn't argue. He smiled faintly. He had meant to back the brilliant but troubled Mr. Hamilton to study those meteorites more thoroughly, but he'd been a step too late. That didn't matter. Recently, he'd stumbled onto an altogether different mystery that might be even more valuable. Is the magic lamp from fairy tales, the one that grants a person's wishes, real or fake? His eyes flashed as he toyed with the thought. After a moment's silence, Lex bade them goodbye with a small, amused smile and turned to leave. I haven't seen you in days. Your acting's improved. When Lex left, David lingered. Clark's expression barely cracked. If only you hadn't added the unnecessary gestures, he advised. David departed with that bit of counsel. Clark, however, felt anything but gratified by his brother's praise. A gurney was being wheeled past the ward by a nurse. The body was bound for the morgue downstairs. Clark sighed, mood heavy. Another person hurt by a meteorite. If he hadn't brought that rock to town, Mr. Killitot Hamilton might still be regarded as a respected scientist instead of a madman in the eyes of the townsfolk. Sizzle, click-clack, the steady beeps and hums of the hospital machines, the scrape of bedcasters, the soft wails of babies and sudden cries of pain, all of it slammed into Clark at once, like a tidal surge. His eardrums felt pounded. Ugh, my ears. He clutched his head and stumbled back, collapsing onto a hospital bench. Another ability? Try to control it, he told himself. There's nothing to be afraid of. He'd already learned to handle one new sense, his supervision, thanks to David's guidance. Drawing on that experience, Clark forced himself to focus and breathe, repeatedly convincing himself he could manage this. Gradually, the roar that had filled his head quieted from a white noise crash to a steady din he could tolerate. At the Luther estate that night, in a quiet, empty office, Lex lounged under lamplight, idly stroking an odd object. An unexpected delight from my last visit to the Metropolis Museum, he murmured. A cluster of yellow crystals grew from a matte gray rock base, which sat framed by an antique brass ring etched with Latin. It looked like an ancient artifact, but the materials were unremarkable. Its age couldn't be pinned down. It had come to the museum as part of an Egyptian acquisition and been dismissed by curators as a modern craft, worth not even $100, so it had been tossed into a crate with other odds and ends. When a security guard moved that crate, the crystal slab slipped from a high stack, fell more than 2 meters, and did not crack. Lex, who knew a little about jewelry and gemstones, found that curious. He picked it up to hand it back, but the brass ring bore an inscription. He read the Latin aloud, "Hold this object and make a grand wish." Those 8 words had lodged in his mind. Lex bought it on impulse. At the estate, the crystal sat on his shelf as an amusing curiosity, until yesterday, when a book he took down knocked it off the shelf. It hit the floor and remained unscathed. Intrigued, he tested its limits. It wouldn't break under an iron hammer. A 1,000-degree flame didn't even crack it. It's not like anything made by a human, Lex muttered, turning the cold stone in his hands. He probed every way he could think of to damage it and failed. Its hardness was beyond imagination. On the estate computer, a newly acquired dossier displayed photos of carvings and records from across the centuries. 4,000 years ago, you appeared in the Indus Valley. In 146 BC, you appeared in Carthage. In AD 4, the Kush Empire. An old account even claimed that Romulus Augustus, the last Western Roman emperor, had clutched the stone as he was murdered, refusing to let it go even as he died. "Mirror, mirror, tell me, what is your secret?" Lex asked softly, as if trying to mock a fairy tale. He held the stone and spoke those words like an incantation. Nothing happened. He hadn't even intended a wish. His tone was half mocking. Either the artifact had strict conditions for wish-making, or its cost was enormous. Otherwise, Romulus would have lived and ruled on, he said, voice low. Under the lamp, his face fell into shadow, ambition coiled behind his smile. "No rush. I'll uncover your secret first." Only then would he decide what to wish for. More knowledge about meteorites, or the world's crown, become a modern Alexander? For now, he let the possibilities sit like tinder. Later, after a warm, pleasant dinner, David walked Kira to the edge of the farm under a starry sky and a cool breeze. As the one who already knew Kira, he'd been asked by his parents to see her off. "Thank you for today," she said. They walked in silence for a dozen yards before David answered. "It's nothing, Nama. I'd do anything for you." Kira's steps were light and her face brightened. "You are the destined savior." David winced. "Please don't call me Nama." He couldn't accept that label. He'd tolerated odd nicknames in the past, but now Kira was a family friend, and David's parents liked her. "You were close to Clark. The Say guy, this savior-destroyer the tribe prophesies, definitely isn't him. Give him a girl and he gets flustered. How could he destroy the world?" Aliens could easily seem different to ancient people, strength equal to 10 men, eyes that could shoot fire. The heavenly fire that accompanied a landing was probably the flash of a ship. The natives likely had no concept of continents. Their world might have been just a valley. Of course, Kara smiled. She too disliked Nama as intimate address and brightened a little. "Can I call you David?" When he didn't object, she relaxed and went on to defend Clark. She remembered meeting him, shy, kind, always worried about family. But even a cruel crocodile is a cute baby when it's newborn. Still, she couldn't dismiss 500 years of tribal prophecy so easily. Her expression turned serious. A lion's bloodthirst is in its bones. Even if it fights its fate, it can't live on grass forever. Sooner or later, it shows its teeth. In the attic of the farmhouse warehouse, Clark had been practicing controlling his new sense and overheard the conversation as David escorted Kira away. He froze at the words he caught. Nama? Sagai? Destroy the world. Me? They must be joking, he told himself. David and Kira were talking about some myth and about him in a way that made his stomach drop. David returned and climbed to the attic to join him, leaving the night's breeze and stars for a quieter vantage point. Clark watched his brother come up the stairs, his face clouding with hurt and confusion. David, he said, voice tight, what were you and Kira talking about? Son, what did you put on my body yesterday? That morning at the breakfast table, Jonathan ate Martha's sandwich with surprising vigor. He showed no sign of the poisoning, fever, and coma from the day before. In fact, he seemed better than ever, full of energy. A faint look of bewilderment crossed his face as he tried to remember. It was the Dionysus factor, David said. That Dionysus thing, is it metal? Jonathan asked, puzzled, as if thinking about airport security. David smiled. You can think of it as an herbal tonic. The Dionysus factor could grant immortality and resurrection, but it didn't necessarily change how a person looked. Ra's al Ghul had lived for centuries and still appeared middle-aged. The Joker, in some iterations, had the factor, and yet no child's face. Maybe it doesn't affect outward age, David added. Martha held the small stone test tube in her hand, eyeing the dark green metallic liquid inside. David had told her to drink it that morning, saying it would be good for her. Even though she trusted her son, she hesitated. People didn't usually swallow metal. She wasn't ill, so maybe she didn't need it yet. Clark, at the table, seemed distracted. He sipped the seafood soup Martha had made without speaking. The previous day, he had asked David about what he'd been talking about with Kira and their younger brother. David had shrugged it off as nothing. But Clark had overheard the gist of that conversation. Words like Sagai and destroy the world stuck with him. David glanced at Clark and sensed there was something on his mind. He thought of Rickman, the man David had killed, and wondered whether Clark was still brooding over it. When Clark asked casually about the previous day's conversation, David had been vague. Being presented as some prophesied savior, or having to say it yourself, would be embarrassing, David had said. He expected Kira to eventually see the prophecy was wrong and let it go. After a slow swallow of soup, David sighed inwardly. It was a misunderstanding that would pass. There was no need to burden anyone with the idea that he might become a world-destroying villain. On the way to school, Chloe and Pietro peppered David with questions. Where did you go these past 2 days? You weren't at school. Family stuff, David answered. I went to Gotham. Gotham. Chloe and Pietro exchanged looks. Rumors followed that name. Isn't that place full of gangs? I heard it's dangerous even during the day, Chloe said, wrinkling her nose. She liked the weird and the wonderful, but not robberies and street violence. David smiled. The arrival of Batman hadn't fixed Gotham's corrupt ecosystem, but the masked vigilante had at least made criminals think twice. There's a masked vigilante there. They call him Batman. Pietro nodded. I've seen the news. Batman. Clark, who had been staring out the window, tightened his lips. When he'd gone to Gotham the day before, he had been focused on finding clues to save his father and hadn't had time to think about anything else. What he'd seen there, though, had left him unsure. Bruce Wayne, the billionaire heir of the Waynes, no superpowers, stepping forward in a corrupt city to protect its vulnerable citizens, had struck him. Batman took real risks for people who couldn't protect themselves. From what Clark had observed, Batman was a hero. That realization unsettled him. If Batman would stand beside David in the future, what did that mean for him? Miss Cassandra's prediction had shown Batman on the opposite side of Clark. Kira's tribal prophecy whispered that Clark might be the one to destroy the world, an evil buried in his bones. The thought made him swallow hard. Could it be that while watching David to keep him from turning bad, Clark himself would become the monster? Clark? David's voice snapped him back. Seeing Clark shake his head violently, as if refusing to accept the thought, David patted him. Don't tell me you're still thinking about Rickman. Clark hesitated. He had been angry at first. He had believed David had started killing people recklessly after what they'd done to Rickman. But then Chloe had shown him a news report. On the school bus, Clark lowered his voice. There was a director at the Metropolis Environmental Center named Paul. He never took bribes and fought corrupt officials. He lived in a cheap apartment with his wife and child. He was a decent man. Clark's voice dropped. One morning he met Rickman, who was being questioned about pollution from his factories. Paul's death was ruled a suicide, jumping off a building. The news showed the scene, his wife and young child grieving over his wrapped body. Clark's words were heavy with bitterness. Rickman used his powers to destroy a decent man and ruin a family. It wasn't an isolated incident. Other suicides and suspicious deaths over the years hinted at Rickman's involvement. Clark still didn't entirely trust David's vigilante justice, but he no longer believed Rickman was innocent or undeserving of the fate he'd met. David's expression hardened, but he left the matter. "Next time you visit someone you don't know well, check the soles of your shoes," he said lightly. "Soles of shoes?" Clark blinked. Pietro, always ready to change the subject, leaned in. "Hey, have you seen the schedule? Today's biology class. Apparently the new teacher is mature and beautiful. They're going to talk about gender today. I heard there will be videos." He grinned in a way that was half joke, half wink. "Can you stop acting like a horny baboon?" Chloe snapped, scowling. Clark flushed and pretended not to understand. David's gaze drifted out the window. There was a knock on the heavy wooden door. Luther, handling business in the castle, spoke as someone opened it. His new head of security ushered in a visitor. "Mr. Keluo, Mr. Luther is waiting for you inside," the tall, muscular man in a black suit and sunglasses said. He smiled in a way that suggested he was pleased about something. Not the most professional composure for a bodyguard commander, but he stood aside and closed the door. Luther leaned back in the comfortable boss's chair and extended a hand. "Please, have a seat, Mr. Keluo." "Thank you, Mr. Luther." Mr. Keluo, a plain-looking middle-aged man, looked around the luxurious room with a cautious awe, as if afraid to touch anything. He smoothed his suit, sat stiffly, and watched the new captain bow and leave. A knowing smile flickered across Luther's face as he regarded his guest. Since morning, Mr. Luther had been running a little experiment with the wishing stone he had acquired. He called in a young, somewhat reckless bodyguard, Mashiaer, formally addressed as Mr. Keluo, from the team to his office. In a tone that oozed favor, he praised the man's potential and sharp instincts, hinting at a promotion to the young bodyguard who could barely keep still in the hallway. Mashiaer's excitement was barely contained. Playing the part of a witty, generous boss, Mr. Luther produced the wishing stone and said with a smile, "Hold the stone and make a wish, Mashiaer. Maybe your wish will come true." The bodyguard did as he was told, eyes wide with hope. In truth, Mr. Luther had no real intention of promoting him, at least not yet. Less than an hour later, the captain of the bodyguards submitted his resignation, saying his child had been in a car accident and that he wanted to go home after years of neglecting his family. Any of the remaining guards could have been promoted. That morning, while Mr. Luther was walking around the manor, a chunk of gravel had broken off from the 7 to 8 meter high castle wall and fallen, almost hitting his head. If Mashiaer hadn't seen it first and tackled him out of the way, Mr. Luther might now be in hospital. "Mr. Luther, why did you call me here?" Mashiaer, Mr. Keluo, asked nervously, sitting opposite the desk. He kept replaying recent work at the factory, worrying he'd missed something. "Relax, it's nothing," Mr. Luther said, letting his voice soften. He chatted amiably, slowly easing the other man's tension. "But one lucky incident isn't enough, far from enough." A ruthless glint flashed through his eyes, even as his face remained smiling. "Mr. Keluo, I've been very pleased with your recent performance. You've kept the factory warehouse in order. Ever since you took over, there haven't been any missing items." Mashiaer rubbed the back of his head, embarrassed. "It's what I should do, Mr. Luther." "No, honest, outstanding people deserve rewards," Mr. Luther said, holding the man's gaze and letting the hint hang in the air. "Whether it's a country or a factory, you need a system of rewards and punishments to win people's loyalty." He reached under the desk, drew out the small, ancient-looking wishing stone, and like a tempter offering a forbidden apple, coaxed softly, "Make a wish, Mr. Keluo." The scene cut away abruptly to another world entirely, the school. Every time old-fashioned teacher Kowalski reaches this chapter, he opens with that same dusty sex ed film. Pietro muttered as the bell rang. Pietro beamed as he stepped into the classroom. Finally, I don't have to suffer through that again, he said. At the front, under the lowered projector screen, the students expected the usual 60-year-old stickler with reading glasses. Instead, the room filled with golden morning light as a striking woman in her 30s walked in. Teacher Ai-jin Si, the new biology and health education teacher. She wore a neat blouse and a short skirt, and she reached up to pull down the projection screen. Many of the boys froze, their attention fixed as the hem of her skirt shifted when she moved. David raised an eyebrow. Who told you that, Pietro? My dad, Pietro answered, hardly concealing his grin. Students, please sit down. Ai-jin-si said, keeping her voice professional despite the heat. I'm your new teacher, Ai-jin-si. I'll be teaching biology, health education, and human anatomy. The classroom felt unusually warm. Clark, who had just swallowed, fanned himself theatrically, trying to seem casual. Summer's coming. Of course everyone's hot, he whispered to his brother. Pietro and the other boys watched as Ai-jin-si stepped to the podium and then moved to stand by the open window, fanning herself. The film began to play, but most of the boys were not looking at the projection. David frowned. He wasn't the type to ogle, and Ai-jin-si wasn't normally his type. Clark, flushed and parched, kept switching his gaze between the screen and the teacher. Suddenly, a spark flashed on the projector. Puff, flames licked the edge of the screen. Fire! Someone shouted. The room erupted into panic. Clark's earlier daydreams vanished. Instinct took over. Ai-jin-si kept her composure, directing the students to evacuate while staff rushed in with extinguishers. Within minutes, the small blaze was out, but the biology lesson was over. Oh, that's one way to make a memorable first class, Pietro said ruefully. He looked dejected, like a devotee whose deity had been interrupted mid-ceremony. Some of the boys lingered in disappointed silence. Outside in the corridor, students drifted toward the blooming cherry trees, the air cooling a little in the shade. Ai-jin-si coordinated with the faculty, making sure everyone was safe. David stood a little apart, watching, and didn't bother to size up the new teacher further. He wasn't going to target someone who hadn't provoked him. Class dismissed early. The group of students spilled out and began heading home. Clark, how's your physics report coming along? Lana asked as she caught up with them, books tucked under her arm. She smiled brightly at Clark, who returned the smile like a proud suitor. It's going well. How about you? He replied. Pietro nudged David. You missed a few episodes while you were gone. Lana and Clark have gotten close. Don't underestimate a guy who's finally found his courage. David blinked. He hadn't expected Clark to turn his awkwardness into something useful. The tall, steady boy who used to blush at every girl had slowly become more confident. Even Lana, captain of the cheer squad and used to being chased, couldn't help but be drawn to him. Lana joined the group and laughed with Clark as they boarded the school bus together. At the gate, someone watched from the shadows. Whitney stood with his jaw clenched, his face going green with envy. He balled his fist until the veins stood out on the back of his hand, and the tattoo coiled around his wrist glowed a dense, unnatural green. This time, your brother won't be able to protect you, he muttered through gritted teeth, the promise of trouble simmering beneath the surface. Chapter 71. I Want to Become a Goddess, 2-in-1. Miss Aikens! Miss Aikens! Aikens brushed past the cluster of male teachers like a heat wave through the school gate. They begged her for dates, offered concerts, pleaded with desperate hope. She refused them all and climbed into a gleaming red Mustang, sunglasses hiding her eyes as she drove out onto the main road. A few persistent suitors chased her car, waving tickets and shouting, but she ignored them. Her reddish-orange hair whipped in the wind as she gripped the wheel. She had not come back to Smallville to date a bunch of high school teachers who couldn't even afford a detached house. There was only one man in town who could catch her attention, Rex Luthor, heir to a vast fortune. A manic look touched Aikens' face as she steered toward the Luthor estate. Rex's vaults must hold treasures beyond imagining. She pressed the accelerator, impatience sharpening every line of her face. Behind a massive desk in a shadowed study, Rex Luthor frowned. Machiere had just been promoted to head of the bodyguards, but the celebration went sour when someone leaked humiliating photos of him drunk and disgraceful at a bar. Rex was not a sentimental boss. He only wanted to know whether this was one isolated scandal or whether others who had used the wishing stone were suffering misfortunes as well. He clasped his hands and rested his chin on them, the weight of suspicion dark in his eyes. The door swung open with a bang. "Who are you?" Rex barked. A woman in a pink miniskirt and an attitude to match strolled in and surveyed the room like it was decor she had no intention of keeping. "This style is too old-fashioned," she said, entirely ignoring his question. "For an old manor, I didn't expect the study of a rumored Playboy socialite to look like a museum." "Who let you in?" Rex snapped, glancing toward the guards. "Ma chère, I pay you a fortune. You're not supposed to let just anyone in." The bodyguards bristled at his tone. They adored Ikens, worshipped her as if she were a goddess of beauty come down to earth. They could not bear to see Rex rude to their idol. "You don't seem to like me," Ikens teased, letting herself drop onto the solid wood desk as if the furniture were hers. She leaned in, eyes playful. "Madam, there's a difference between being sexy and being wanton," she added with a mock wink. Rex looked at her with cold disdain, but Ikens only laughed. "You've misunderstood. I don't need to sell my body. Men fall for me with a flick of my wrist." She leaned in and let loose a deliberately intoxicating scent, a sugary, cheap perfume that clung to the air. Rex's face tightened. He was trying to maintain distance, but the woman in front of him was beautiful in a way that made his mouth go dry. His iron control wavered. "Nevertheless, for you, I might make an exception," he said, rising on an impulse that surprised even himself. Ikens' smile froze for a heartbeat. Then she leaned forward and kissed him. Rex began to pull away, but quickly surrendered to the softness of her lips. When they separated, his eyes were glazed and loving, naive as if she were the center of his world. "Miss, may I know your name?" he asked, taking her hand and kissing it with a clumsy, awed grace. He was utterly beside himself, nothing at all like the Rex Luthor everyone whispered about. Ikens let the charade play out, amused and satisfied. "Before we go any further," she said, "prove your sincerity. Show me your most precious treasure." "Close the door. All of you leave," Rex ordered, both to his guards and to himself. They didn't move until Ikens suggested it. Loyalty to her outweighed protocol. Once the room was empty and the door shut, Rex opened a small safe on his desk and pulled out a palm-sized yellow crystal. "A statue carved from a single yellow gem?" Akins exclaimed, though the citrine seemed oddly cloudy, as if something lay trapped inside it. "It's a citrine," Rex murmured, stroking it like a relic. "But it's my treasure. It grants wishes." Akins sneered, hands eager to examine the thing. She tested it with a hammer and chisel. The stone didn't even flinch. Her hand throbbed from the impact, but her eyes shone with greedy delight. This was the magic lamp from every fairy tale. What couldn't she get with it? "How does it work? Do I rub it?" she demanded. "Hold it and make a wish," Rex answered, lowering his voice as if the walls themselves had ears. "I haven't figured out its limits." He hesitated, almost wanting to warn her of side effects, but the room was suddenly full of his surrendered adoration, and Ikens was impatient. She imagined global power at her fingertips. "Put this stone in front of anyone, and they'd lose it," she said. "Even the president would go insane for it." "I want to become a true goddess," she whispered, gripping the crystal. "Like Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty." She closed her eyes and wished it. For a long, stunned second, nothing happened. No blinding light, no angelic chorus, not even a tremor in the stone. Then subtly at first, warmth threaded through her skin. Her breath caught. Something deep and inexorable had started to change. Summer had settled over Smallville. In the Kent kitchen, Martha sat in front of an electric fan and fussed over the bills. "Honey, want a cold soda?" she called. Jonathan came in from working the fields, still sweaty but buoyant. He peeled off his gloves, opened the fridge, and grinned at his wife. "I wouldn't say no." Martha wiped the sweat from her neck. "Our cows are melting out in the sun, but you look fine." "Maybe it's that factor," Jonathan said, handing her a chilled bottle. They had both been unnerved and exhilarated by the strange metal water their younger son had left behind, and the talk of unearthly cures. Eternal life was a heavy thought, and Martha worried at it in secret, but the unexpected energy that had come to them made summer more bearable. "Hey, we're back!" David called, opening the door. Both sons bounded in. Martha glanced at them, habitually asking about their day. David, Clark, how was school? Fine, except for the little fire in biology, David said, popping open a soda. A fire? What happened? Martha asked, alarmed. It was my fault, Clark admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. He'd been practicing control, and one of the Kryptonian abilities, heat vision, had flickered awake in a small, startling way. My eyes got hot, then a tiny flame burst where I was looking. Why were you staring? Jonathan asked, pressing for details. David smirked. You should be thanking me. Clark looked away before things got worse. Otherwise, that new biology teacher might have been traumatized, and we'd have another staff replacement on our hands. Teacher Eikens? Martha blinked. She's the new one? Cough, yes, Clark said, his face flushing as David grinned at his brother's expense. Their parents exchanged a worried look. Clark, control your emotions. Don't forget, your eyes can be dangerous. Don't worry, Mom and Dad. Ms. Eikens isn't around now. David laughed, and Clark, more confident than before, added, I found a trick to control these things. A trick? Clark hesitated, then explained, I stopped fighting them. If I stop treating them like a problem or a sign I'm different, it gets easier to control them. Jonathan and Martha relaxed a little. They welcomed any sign that Clark's inner burdens were lifting. Let's celebrate with a big lunch today, Martha suggested, smiling. They sat down to a wholesome family meal, roasted pumpkin, pine nut catfish, hearty beef stew. Mid-bite, the television in the corner flicked to breaking news. The anchor, grave-faced, announced, This is Metropolis Midday. Yesterday, a bank vault in Smallville was mysteriously robbed. There were no signs of forced entry. A large quantity of jewels and gold bars simply vanished. Officer Bob is on the scene. The Kents stopped eating. Officer Bob, a familiar local face, led reporters through the baffling scene. The only tentative conclusion, footprints suggested whoever had taken the items had passed through walls, no physical form entering or leaving the vault. Metahumans? David muttered. It was sensational, but nobody had been hurt, so the family let it sink in as odd news and moved on. After lunch, Clark stepped outside to practice. From fence post to the cattle trough, he focused his heat vision carefully, melting a bit of rock here, warming water there without harming anything. He even managed to heat a plastic trough continuously without melting it. Control was becoming real. David watched, impressed. Looks like Mom won't have to heat milk every morning, he quipped. Clark smiled. I was taught a few strange things, he admitted when David asked where he'd learned to handle such powers. Conversation drifted to odd artifacts, Lazarus pits, Dionysus factors, and Clark's curiosity about magicians and aliens. If the world had aliens, why not magicians? Do you really think that stone grants wishes? Martha asked later, still curious. Back at Luther Manor, Eikens felt the changes in herself deepening. The warmth bloomed into something more, a subtle reweaving of muscles, of posture, as if every line of her body were being redrawn to a different standard. She flexed her fingers, thrilled and a little unnerved. Across town, after school, the bus let David and Clark off at the usual spot near the farm. They waved goodbye to Chloe and Pietro, then started toward home. A figure stepped out from beneath a street lamp shadow and blocked their path. The voice that followed was cold and sharp. Clark, I warned you, stay away from Lana. The figure's tone carried an edge of anger that made the hairs on Clark's arms prickle. But you seem to have completely ignored me, the stranger continued, hands in pockets, posture tight with warning. Whitney stood in front of the farmhouse with a cold expression, blocking David and Clark's path. Whitney, what do you want? Clark asked, wary and surprised. It's obvious, Whitney snapped. You couldn't beat me in the war over Lana, so you're trying other methods. David watched the exchange, slightly amused. He had never been good at reading romance. Clark's shy honesty was foreign to him. Whitney was the typical handsome blonde athlete, arrogant and used to getting his way. That he'd been outmatched by Clark stung. Clark, I warned you. Don't blame me for what happens today. Whitney pulled his hands from his pockets, clenched his fists until his knuckles cracked, and glared like an animal ready to strike. What gives you the right to show up on my doorstep like this? Clark demanded. David ignored Whitney's theatrics and sized him up. At the bar months ago, even surrounded by his own teammates, David had knocked Whitney down without effort. Whitney had developed a real fear of him then, but that was the past. I admit you can fight, David said coolly, but you couldn't touch a single hair on me now. Whitney sneered, rolled up his sleeve, and revealed a glowing tattoo beneath his skin. Since joining that mysterious team, the tattoo had granted him an ability, one of the new powers that had appeared around town. Even if you beat me up, it won't change a thing, he said. Under the tattoo's strange glow, infused with meteorite radiation, Clark's Kryptonian strength began to wane. His legs went weak and he swayed. This is exactly what Lana hates, he said weakly, trying to reason with Whitney. I'll hit you first, then we'll talk, Whitney snarled. Clark's warning only poured gasoline on Whitney's jealousy. He swung at Clark, aiming for his head. David stepped forward to block, intending to take the blow for Clark, an attack that would have been nothing to him. Whitney raised his fist and taunted, "Let me show you my power. I'll teach your disobedient brother a lesson right in front of you." But when the punch passed through David's body like a ghost through a curtain, it struck nothing. David's figure vanished from where Whitney expected him to be. In a blink, he and Clark were 20, maybe 30 meters away. Whitney's face shifted from triumph to confusion. He frowned, as if he might be hallucinating. "You? How did you? Aren't you going to check on David?" Clark asked quickly, already regaining a little strength now that he had some distance from the kryptonite glow. "Are you all right?" David raised an eyebrow at the bewildered Whitney and answered tersely, "I'm fine." Whitney, enraged and baffled, stammered. He'd been humiliated before by David and his friends. They had knocked him and his teammates down in front of everyone. Now he saw that David, like many in town, had an ability born of meteorite influence. "So you've got powers too? Is that a tattoo?" Clark's protest was drowned out as Whitney stared at David with a mix of fury and hurt pride. "I figured it out. This is how you beat us that time." David glanced at the tattoo on Whitney's wrist. "Did someone discover kryptonite luminescence and make special tattoos based on it?" Whitney roared like an enraged bull and charged. David flicked a small stone with his foot. It skittered across the ground like a bullet, but passed harmlessly through Whitney. Whitney only sneered and continued his rush. "It's useless. You can't hurt me," David observed quietly. Whitney's ability let him pass through solid matter. His body could dematerialize. It seemed to protect him from physical harm. Can he precisely control it, letting some things pass through him while keeping others solid? David wondered. He moved like a shadow and suddenly appeared behind Whitney, his hand chopping down in a blur. Whitney's punch met nothing but air. When David finished the maneuver, he was calmly watching from a distance. Whitney spun, seeing David behind him, and threw another furious punch that again hit empty space. He felt toyed with, helpless, and humiliated. "If you're so capable, stay still. What's the point of dodging all the time?" David kept his voice level. "It's a passive effect, isn't it? He's invulnerable defensively, but he lacks the speed and strength other powered people have. Offensively, he can make himself solid to hit, but defensively, he's unique." Whitney could phase through attacks, but his own strength and speed were nothing special. "If I hadn't held back, you'd be on the ground already," Whitney growled. He swung again. David blinked out of the way easily and said, "Go home, Whitney." Clark flashed forward and planted himself between the two, worry in his face. "This ends now. Don't go down a bad path." Whitney's expression turned cold as he remembered how he'd obtained the tattoo. "You think I got this just by chance?" he spat. "The bank robbery. A gang got in and out without damaging the vault or the floor and stole everything. They used powers like mine." He looked at them both, venom in his eyes. "I was minding my own business, and then Lana starts avoiding me. You two were together, and I went out, drank, and met people. One of them got me this. A little meteorite solution, some tattoo ink, and boom. You can phase into bank vaults like a ghost. I didn't expect that after I toyed with the police, I couldn't even land a single hit on you." He aimed to goad them both closer, to force a confrontation. "Do your parents have powers like yours?" David said nothing, uninterested in Whitney's descent into criminal excuses. When Whitney threatened their family, a cold light flared in David's eyes. "Enough." A purple beam of energy lanced from David's position, slicing through the ground at Whitney's feet. The earth exploded upward. A deep pit 2 meters deep opened in an instant. Whitney's feet found nothing, and he toppled in. You can shoot lasers from your eyes, huh? Whitney shouted, pulling himself to his feet at the bottom of the pit, bewildered. Whitney used his phasing to walk up through the dirt, seemingly unconcerned. He climbed as if traversing a stream bed, inching toward David again. Your power that could level skyscrapers can't touch me. You're right, I'm strange, part solid, part ethereal. David watched him without emotion. There's one thing you haven't thought about. Whitney's steps faltered. He was still human. He couldn't fly. He couldn't ignore gravity, and most importantly, he had to breathe. Those facts hadn't changed because his molecules could pass through stone. Whitney stopped and looked up at David, forced to acknowledge the truth in the silent stare. So what? Whitney said with a sneer that tried to hide panic. Can you lock me in a box and suffocate me? What can hold me? Or are you going to drain all the air from the area in one breath? David didn't answer with words. He moved a few meters and willed heat into the air, using universe energy to raise the surrounding temperature. The heat licked outward. The air within dozens of meters turned thin and stifling. Whitney, who had just stepped out of the dirt, found each breath becoming a rasp. He dropped to his knees, clutching his throat, his face flushing red. I can't breathe. Help me. Whitney crawled and panted, eyes wide with genuine terror. Clark, nearly used to his brother's ruthlessness, lunged forward, trying to help Whitney. But as soon as he got close, the glow from Whitney's tattoo bathed Clark in kryptonite radiation. The effect hit Clark like a physical blow. His limbs went limp and his vision blurred. He slumped unconscious. David, unmoved, turned and carried Clark to safety. Whitney lay at the edge of consciousness, his pleas growing weak. David glanced at the tattoo on Whitney's wrist, then away with cold detachment. Solid and ethereal, he said softly. You still have to breathe. Whitney's last sight was David's impassive face. Panic crashed over him in a final wave of regret. He shouldn't have come here, he thought. He hadn't expected his power's one human limitation to be exploited. His outstretched hands fell uselessly to the ground. His breathing slowed, then stopped. A faint, broken cry left him. Why? Why is this happening? He whispered, and then there was nothing. Sometime later, elsewhere, a bright mirror slammed to the floor. A bronze antique mirror shattered, the heavy frame smashing into the wood and gouging into the earth below. Behind a large desk, Icons shrieked, a high, grating sound that made the hairs on anyone's neck stand up. Even with her tremendous strength, speed, and an almost impenetrable body, she felt the loss keenly. In her hands, she clutched a stone, the wishing stone, its surface gleaming. In the ancient, elegantly furnished study, Luther stood nearby, his eyes filled with a devotion so deep it looked like worship. He hovered like a servant, willing to do anything for her. Icon's face had twisted with anger. Her skin had grown rough and bloated, her voice harsh and unpleasant. She pressed the stone to her palm, eyes sharp with desperation. Is this what the wishing stone gives me? No, I won't accept this. I want another wish. Wait, no. Icons' sudden realization cut off her next step. Chapter 73, Meteorite Water Recipe. After Icons wished to become a goddess like Aphrodite, she felt power rising through her, her body growing stronger, transfiguring towards something transcendent, like a true deity. But the change came with a cost. Her skin had grown rough and coarse, her features cruelly twisted, and her voice had turned hoarse. Wait, this isn't right. She ran her hands over her face in dismay. She had asked to become a goddess. She shouldn't look like this. Had Lex Luthor been right after all? Wishing on that stone carried a price? So the price of my wish is my beauty. Panic rose in her. If she made another wish to restore her looks, would she lose other things, her emotions, her lifespan, her sight? Where would it end if every wish demanded a sacrifice and she couldn't keep wishing forever? Her mind raced. I want you to wish me back to a goddess's beauty and figure. Her eyes sharpened and she pointed at Rex. Though her appearance had been marred, her power of enchantment had multiplied, hundreds of times stronger than before, like a true goddess of love who could topple wills. A triumphant smile curved her lips. She wanted Rex to bear her wish's cost. Rex's gaze was glazed with infatuation, as if the stone's infinite magic suddenly belonged to him by right. He asked, unabashed, "May I make a wish of my own?" Aiken's caution flared. Love could blind a man, but it did not turn him into a thoughtless puppet. He still had ambitions. What would you wish for? Rex's eyes shone with longing. I want a brain, the strongest scientific mind in the world. Akins blinked. She'd feared he might wish for her heart or some other sentimental thing. Why not wish for endless wealth? Or to be president? Or to rule the earth? He smiled slowly. Money and power buy you talent, but they don't make it yours. Look at humanity. We crawled out of the trees and mastered this planet, tamed the elements, speak to anyone on the other side of the globe with a tap, cross oceans in an hour, walk the moon. That all happened because of technology. If you want it, I'll give it to you. Ikens hesitated. Aren't you afraid of the price? As long as I have you, he said, bowing like a gentleman while taking the stone, I am not afraid to lose anything. Flattered, Akins rewarded him with a kiss and handed him the wishing stone. And we can let others make wishes for me, she added. Rex's face flickered with a schemer's satisfaction. With so many people around, why should he shoulder the cost alone? At dusk, on the outskirts of a small town, a junkyard heaped with scrapped cars and rusting metal hid a different scene. David had followed a lead from a bar and arrived silently. At the junkyard's shack entrance, a group of men drank beer and played cards. When they saw him, their cards were dropped and guarded stances taken. Who are you? Get out, the leader snapped. Medium built, bandana tied back in a flame pattern, leather jacket studded, he had the tough guy air of a small-time gang boss. Didn't you see the private property sign? David tossed down a photo of Whitney. Are you the ones who robbed the bank with her? One of the men tried to play dumb. What bank robbery? The leader's face hardened. He shoved the man aside. Who told you about this? Whitney? Suddenly, the men reached for makeshift weapons, stools, bats, and one hand slid to a pistol at a hip. David's gaze swept the group and landed on a green tattoo on the arm of a man in a denim vest. He spoke coldly. Who mixed meteorite solution into tattoo ink? That phrase made the long-haired tattooed man flinch. There was something in David's bearing that felt immovable, like a mountain. His presence made men shrink. You know too much. Grab him! The leader snarled and waved his men forward. David hadn't come to let anyone walk away. He activated his power. A beam of concentrated heat lanced from his eyes, intended to sear the air around them. Instead, it cut clean and terrible. Two men dropped as if a guillotine had passed through them. Blood fountained as their bodies slid apart at the waist. The sudden brutality stunned everyone into silence. The leader fired his pistol, but the bullets clanged harmlessly at David's feet. He emptied the gun. It made no difference. Terror replaced bravado. The remaining men touched themselves, eyes wide. Please, mercy. They didn't trust them, so they weren't tattooed, someone panted. Their abilities were. The leader, panic overtaking him, activated his own power and charged David, throat raw with fury. He meant to rip the boy's head apart and end him. David barely moved. Beams of heat and power swept outward. Rebar and cement tore from the shack wall as if paper. The leader gasped for breath, clutching his neck as the overwarm air burned his lungs. Not many steps taken, he collapsed, choking, color flooding out of his face. His men fell to their knees and begged. David walked among them like someone passing a few dying lambs, stopping in front of the long-haired tattooist who had kept his back turned the whole time. You're the one who thought of mixing meteorite solution with tattoo ink. The man stammered, face ashen. Yes, I'm just a tattoo artist. Please, don't kill me. Piece by piece, under interrogation, the story came out. The artist, Laurent, had discovered a meteorite fragment that glowed. Curious, he ground it down, mixed it with water and his tattoo ink, and tried it on himself and a few friends, thinking he'd created glow-in-the-dark tattoos. Instead, the compound gave people the ability to phase, pass through solid objects. Greed followed discovery. They used the power to rob a bank vault, recruiting Whitney to help transport the loot. But you said the ability had a time limit, David said. He glanced at one of the dead men, his skin taking on a bluish-purple sheen. What was that about? Laurent shrugged helplessly. He wasn't a scientist, only a hospitable observer. The effect faded with time. At first, the phasing could last half a day. Then it shortened each use until it lasted only minutes or vanished entirely. Some people lost the ability completely in a few days. Getting more tattoos didn't restore it. They'd begun recruiting fresh people, new blood like Whitney, to keep their crimes going. David leveled his stare. What's the formula? Please spare me, Laurent begged. David's eyes flashed a hard purple. Heat rolled from him like a tide. Laurent, staring at the charred corpses, trembled and finally whispered the brand of the tattoo ink he had used and the rest of what he knew about his crude mixture. Satisfied, David turned and left the junkyard. Relief and fear danced across the long-haired man's features until a precise beam of energy found his heart. He fell forward, igniting, the flames licking up through his body. David sent a few more beams through the remaining corpses until the whole junkyard was alight. He walked away through the heat and smoke, expression unreadable. At home, with the brand name and crude recipe in hand, David considered his options. He already had formidable defenses. He didn't need another power. But having the phasing ability in his repertoire couldn't hurt. If the solution worked by simply drawing the pattern on skin, Laurent had said even a quick sketch could let it seep in, though it rubbed off easily, then it might be worth trying as a contingency. Author's note: recently I've had some family matters. An elder is seriously ill, so I've been taking a short break and have written a few hundred words less today. I'll make it up double tomorrow. I've been a bit lax these past days because of family, but starting tomorrow, I'll aim for at least 6,000 words a day. Please continue to follow the story. On his way home, David stopped at the department store and bought tattoo ink. As he passed the corner, he idly tossed the plastic bottle into the air, plucked it out of the air with one hand, and glanced down a side street, and froze. Smallville Hospital was under construction, the hum of drills and hammers filling the air, and over the scaffolding, a new gilded sign gleamed. Wayne Group, Smallville Hospital. Wayne Group. David's eyelids flickered. The Wayne Group was a Gotham colossus, a family empire that had shaped that city for generations. For it to be stirring, expanding into metropolis, and to pick the inconspicuous rural town of Smallville, it didn't make sense. Avery, he thought. Avery had made a scene in Gotham without hiding his identity. Bruce Wayne would likely have followed that trail straight here. David's shoulders tightened. Batman's instinct was to suspect and probe. If Bruce took an interest, Smallville and the Kent farm would be dragged into something they didn't need. A memory, raw and immediate, pulled him back to the warehouse door that morning. Clark had woken at dawn, found his brother gone, and when David returned, Clark had rushed forward to block him, eyes wild. "Did you kill Whitney?" Clark had demanded. David had been calm as ever. "This is how I do things, Clark." There'd been no ripple of guilt, just that flat, controlled tone Clark had learned to expect. "Don't forget who brought this on." Clark froze. The truth sat on his face. This had begun because of him. "Whitney probably just wanted to scare us," he said, clinging to hope. "Not actually hurt Mom and Dad." David's mouth tightened. "I'm not like that bat, guarding against everyone all day, but I'm not like you either, always putting too much faith in people." He walked on as if the argument was over. There's no telling what someone full of jealousy and anger might do. If there's the slightest chance they're dangerous, I'll cut it off. Clark's jaw worked. "David, didn't you say Mom and Dad wouldn't die after taking that medal?" His voice had an edge of accusation. He hadn't meant it. He had brought back the Dionysus factor because he wanted to stop his parents from being vulnerable again. Now the words hung between them, heavier than he'd expected. David stopped in the doorway, turned slowly, and fixed Clark with a cold look. "What do you mean by that?" The question came low, steady, as if a tide of anger lay under a calm surface. Clark's face flushed. He tried to explain, but it came out clumsy. "I didn't mean it like that. I brought the factor back for Mom and Dad so I wouldn't have to worry about something like this happening again." David took 2 steps closer and jabbed a finger hard into Clark's chest. "It's not so Mom and Dad can be fearless of injury or scare your saintly heart into comfort, Clark." His words hit like a bruise. Clark felt the sting and the truth of it. David's anger wasn't just about tactics. It was protective and absolute. Watching his brother turn and go upstairs, Clark clawed at his hair and muttered to himself, furious and ashamed. He'd spoken without thinking, again. At the doorway, David paused, glanced back at Clark, standing in the dim light by the warehouse, and shook his head. Clark could be more mature than most of his age, David thought, but he still had the impulsiveness of an 18-year-old. He let the thought go and climbed the stairs. It was a bright, clear morning. Golden sunlight poured through the high windows of the old estate where Icon sat at her dressing table, smiling at her reflection. She could not hide the pleasure of her own face. "My dear," said Rex, standing dutifully nearby, "your beauty would make Helen of Troy blush. If Paris had seen you, he'd never have been in doubt where to award the golden apple," Rex added, bowing a little. Akins laughed softly. She had used a mesmerized bodyguard to activate the wishing stone for her wishes. The result had been near miraculous. Her appearance and figure were, in her opinion, masterpiece work, each feature sculpted to perfection. Her voice was a clear, intoxicating thing, a siren's song that set hearts racing. Rex's reward for producing the stone was a cascade of ideas. Ever since the wish, his mind had seemed to open in new ways. Invention after invention, half-formed but brilliant, flowed through him. But Icons paused, a tiny regret flashing in her eyes. Rex was brilliant, unimaginably so now, but he was bald. The shine of his head broke the illusion of romance for her, even on a morning like this. "You always know the right thing to say, Rex," she teased, but the thought niggled. "Beauty is in the eye of the beholder," Rex said, shrugging. He'd been given cleverness rather than looks. His nature hadn't changed, and he was wary. No matter how wonderful the wishing stone seemed, it was almost too good to be true. Unlimited wishes? It sounds dangerous. One wish for now is enough. Icons had already thought it through. She tucked the stone away in her bag and rose, every movement the image of confidence and desire. She wasn't interested in ruling the world, at least not yet. First, she wanted pleasure, possession, to find two young, handsome men to serve her like princes at her feet. "I'll think about the rest when I'm tired of playing in this town," she murmured, and then, the tantalized smile growing broader, she left to scout Smallville Garden for the kind of company she craved. Rex watched her go, brain buzzing with possibilities. Akins licked her lips and felt a thrill run through her. The town had become a playground, and she intended to take everything she wanted. Chapter 75, I Want to Make Another Wish, 3K7. Clark regretted the rash thing he'd blurted out about Whitney last night. He hadn't dared bring it up again, and he went to school with David in a foul mood. After 2 classes, the bell rang and a figure walked in, stylish, impossibly beautiful, carrying a bag, 2 long legs showing beneath short denim shorts. She looked like she belonged on a runway, not in a classroom. So beautiful. Every head turned. A hum of whispers rose like a stirred pot. Pietro's eyes went wide. He stared, unable to tear them away. Even some of the girls flushed. Chloe's face went pink. Someone stood and swallowed. "Who is she? Is the new teacher in the wrong class? I'm the new biology teacher, Jin Si. Don't you remember me?" She set her bag on the podium with the easy confidence of someone used to being seen. Dressed in a red jacket and denim shorts, she smiled like she was addressing a line of kindergartners. Her eyes landed on 2 boys in the back and lit up. "Good morning, teacher Jin Si." The class froze, then answered in unison, mechanical, obedient. David and Clark exchanged a look of alarm. Pietro, Chloe, and the others sat there like marionettes, their expressions glazed, smiles fixed. The room went unnervingly silent, as if someone had sucked the sound out of the air. Icons blinked, puzzled. 2 students weren't reacting, the 2 she had singled out. They stood out like sunflowers turned away from the sun. Her expression changed from amusement to shock. "Why are you conscious?" No one had ever resisted her power before she started using it. "Who are you? What did you do to them?" Clark shook Pietro, trying to snap him out of it, but Pietro only pushed his hand away, still staring at Icons. Clark stood, fists clenched. His classmates had lost themselves, their minds toyed with, and he wasn't going to let that happen. "Are you really Jin Si?" he demanded. David rose too, narrowing his eyes. He wasn't going to play along or hide that he wasn't affected. The woman before them had the same beguiling ability, but this version of Jin Si was far different from yesterday's. She looked almost too perfect, like a carved doll. Would someone with your looks and power pretend to be someone worse than you? He couldn't explain how she had changed so quickly. Had a god granted her a makeover and a power boost because of some wish? He needed answers. "How did you do it? Why don't your powers work on us?" Icon's face hardened. It offended her to think that, after just one day of wishing to be the goddess of love and beauty, anyone could resist her. Change them back, now. Clark moved in a blur. He crossed the room in an instant, grabbed her wrist, and growled. Seeing everyone else smiling like lovesick drones made his skin crawl. Icons struggled, but there was a force underneath her, like a coil tightening. Clark felt as if he had grabbed the tail of some legendary beast. The resistance grew stronger. She shook him off with a snap. Icons leaned back and exhaled. A sweet scent washed over Clark's face. His heart kicked up and his knees weakened. For a moment he forgot to breathe. "No," he said aloud, shaking his head as if to clear it. The charm tried to pull him under, but he wrenched himself free and glared. "You won't control me." Icons laughed softly. "Clark Kent, David Kent, what secrets do you two brothers hide?" She had skimmed the class roster earlier and put names to faces. Now she saw two anomalies. She smiled, grabbed her bag, and moved for the door, leaving a shadow in her wake. "If you want them back to normal, follow me." She still had the wishing stone. She wasn't done having fun and wanted to deal with the two of them away from prying eyes. "You can't run." Clark bolted after her. "I want answers." David looked at the dazed classmates, murmured under his breath, and the air around him rippled with faint purple energy. He teleported after Clark. Besides freeing their friends, he wanted to know how Icons, who had seemed ordinary, had become so powerful overnight. Out on the plains beyond town, Icons, who moved like a typhoon, stopped. Not by choice, she'd been intercepted. Clark reached her first and slapped a hand on her shoulder. "You don't touch a lady without permission." Her pupils flickered. She smiled, threw an elbow back, and the air detonated. The impact hit Clark like a truck. He flew back dozens of meters and only stopped when a hand caught him. "David." David set Clark down and looked at Icons across the field. The older brother had been sent flying without breaking a bone. The younger had calmly caught him. This wasn't the work of ordinary meteor-granted powers. "You're not from this town, are you? Where did you get this strength?" Icons tensed, hiding her bag behind her. She kept her composure and tilted her head. "Don't be so surprised. I've lived here for over 20 years. I just didn't expect to meet two such extraordinary brothers." She had tested her own speed and strength. She moved faster than sound and could bend steel like clay, yet she had just been checked. David's strength and restraint surprised her. "What's in your bag that makes you so protective?" David's gaze went to the reddish-brown bag. It looked expensive, but he suspected it wasn't the real prize. He kept his face blank. "Whatever it is, it doesn't belong in your hands if it's valuable." Icons crossed her arms and drew the bag closer as if to shield it. Her voice dripped with teasing. "Want to take a peek, David Kent? Want to learn a woman's world?" Clark rubbed his ribs, warning. "She can exhale an invisible perfume. I almost got taken under. Don't go near her." David's face was unreadable. Even people joked about Clark's susceptibility to charm. David didn't think a scent would work on him. "Undo your control over our classmates, Ms. Icons." Clark lunged for the bag. David's eyes glowed purple, and he fired 2 focused energy beams. Icons' pupils pinched, and she dodged the searing rays. Clark was on her in an instant, a fist aimed true. She blocked, redirected his momentum with a knife-hand strike, then low-kicked. Clark barely blocked. Something bulged and slammed into his eye. He staggered. Icons moved to press her advantage, and then a thick column of purple energy, like a barrel-thick cannon, shot into the sky, scorching the air. The blast slammed into Icons as if a 100-ton missile had found her, launching her back and carving a deep trench into the earth. She skidded to a stop at the trench's rim, skin stinging, chest heaving. Reckoning, she fumbled the bag and shoved something small and yellow-gray into her jacket. A stone? David had seen it. Someone, presumably Icons, had taken a yellow-gray stone from the bag. He narrowed his eyes. Hiss! Clark got to his feet, rubbing the swelling around his eye. It hurt, but he was glad it wasn't worse. "You call yourself an alien, and you get knocked by a woman's self-defense?" David appeared beside him, quiet and sharp. Clark flushed at his own carelessness. He'd mistaken Icons for just another metahuman and had paid for it. He straightened, face hard. He wouldn't rely on brute force alone again. Icons had been counting on superior speed and charm. Now she was being pummeled by 2 high school boys, one faster than light to her perception, the other immovably strong. She dodged another energy beam and scowled. "What kind of goddess is this?" Is this what a god looks like? They battered her. The lightning-fast one's blows often missed. The solid one's hits were like rocks she couldn't dent. His punches landed like falling meteors. She was forced back by a white shockwave, then slammed into the earth like a skipping stone and rolled before she could stand. Her perfect appearance was ruined, hair askew, a burn on her chest from David's beam, blood at the corner of her mouth. This wasn't the goddess she'd imagined. She clutched at her jacket pocket and found the stone. Desperation sharpened her eyes. If one wish could give her power, then one more might fix this. "I want to wish again," she screamed, voice raw. "I want to keep this face and be 10 times stronger than I am now." Chapter 76. Stop looking at it. It's not a good thing. Ikens clutched the wishing stone tightly in her palm. When David saw the stone and heard the wish, his expression shifted. He recognized it at once. "A wishing stone?" She shouted her wish in a low, fierce voice. Heat surged through Ikens as if she had become a miniature sun. Power poured into her. Her eyes glowed pink, and she felt transformed. Excitement lit her face. "I'm 10 times stronger than before. All of you will bow before me." The sky changed color, and a godlike pressure settled over the area like a physical weight. She roared. The earth cracked beneath her. Her fists split the air and she vanished, reappearing before Clark in an instant. Crack! Clark felt a jagged pain in his chest as if struck by a rocket. He was blasted hundreds of meters away, smashed through a towering stand of trees. From above, the path looked as if a chariot from the sun had barreled through the forest, leaving a long, deep trench. David's heart tightened. "Now it's your turn." Ikens' gaze swept over them, carrying a commanding, almost war goddess majesty. She lunged with a punch. "You have no idea what you're playing with." David met her with a punch of his own. A furious tide of universal energy surged out. Their blows collided, and a gust of wind ripped up the ground. Spiderwebbing cracks spread for dozens of meters as if a 10-ton bomb had detonated, dirt heaving like waves. On ground made as hard as steel by the chaotic pressure, David stood like a mountain, unmoving, eyes cold as blades. His body was tall and strong, showing no sign of injury. His presence was oppressive. Under the violence of the impact, Ikens felt searing pain in her arm and took a step back. Her skin reddened and blistered as if scalded by lava. She stared in disbelief and raised her fist again. Impossible. Why, even with such a massive surge, couldn't she beat him? "How can you still withstand my strength?" Template fusion 5%. David's improved energy manipulation let him meet her more steadily. He threw a punch several times stronger than the last, enough to shake mountains and crack the earth. Bang! A thick, white blast of air exploded and sent Ikens flying. Before she could recover, David moved like lightning, radiating killing intent, and struck again. Ikens blocked with both arms as if a mountain had slammed into her. She couldn't stand the next onslaught and dropped to a knee. The ground cracked in a spider web spreading tens of meters. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth. "No, this can't be. I didn't increase my strength tenfold." She'd been deceived by the false sensation of an enormous power spike. In truth, the boost had been tiny. "You think too highly of whoever made this stone." David raised his fist and slammed down, releasing all the chaotic kinetic energy he'd absorbed at once, like a 10-ton missile strike. Ikens was obliterated and driven into the earth. "And your power's wearing off." A deep pit, tens of meters across, was gouged from the ground. David dropped down and picked up the wishing stone that had fallen beside Ikens, whose bones were broken throughout her body. "Ho!" Her hair had gone gray, her face aged, and she coughed up blood she couldn't stop. Ikens' eyes widened with bitter disbelief. She stretched out a withered skeletal hand to try to grab the stone through the air, clinging to a last hope, but it was futile. David turned the stone over in his hand and shook his head. "Even if your power only increased a few times, a heavily discounted wish, it came at the cost of your life. This stone is not good. Wishing on it is like making a deal with the devil." Now he understood where Ikens' sudden strength had come from. "Please, please, save me." In a short time, her life force drained away. The skeletal Ikens pleaded, and with her last strength, she tried to activate some ability, exhaling a sweet scent like cheap perfume. David waved a hand in front of his nose. "You're dying. Don't try that ridiculous seduction on me." Her life finally extinguished. Ikens' eyes went dull and glassy. She stopped breathing. She's dead? Clark, clutching his chest, had rushed back, bewildered. After being flung by the newly powerful Akins, he'd felt unprecedented pain. He'd thought his ribs might be broken. He'd hurried back despite his injuries, only to find Akins gone. "I didn't do it this time," David said. "She was too greedy. She wished herself to death." Greed, the original sin. A wish? This stone can grant wishes? Clark jumped down into the pit. The brief exposure to the sun's rays had mostly healed his wounds. He stretched and peered at the stone in David's hand. He'd heard childhood stories of magical treasures that could grant wishes, but he'd never expected to see one. "Just now she did seem stronger after she wished," he said slowly, remembering. "Don't look at it. It's not a good thing." David slipped the stone into his shirt pocket. It matched the one Wonder Woman had used to wish her boyfriend back to life once, a wish that in other stories led to the birth of Cheetah. That line of events hadn't unfolded here, though. If that had happened the way the stories say, with the global chaos back then, Mom and Dad wouldn't have been so surprised by Clark, an alien. Why hadn't that storyline appeared here? He hadn't even been born then, and the butterfly effect shouldn't have reached back before his birth. A doubt flickered across David's mind, and then a thought struck him. Time is like a river. When you throw a stone in, the ripples don't just affect the water downstream, they can reach upstream too. There were comic book examples. Barry Allen's Flashpoint changed the world before his mother's death when he traveled back in time. The Waynes leave the theater, get mugged, little Bruce dies in that alley, Thomas Wayne becomes a violent Batman, and Martha snaps and becomes the Joker. David, his younger brother, had fallen quiet and was staring off. Clark called out, pulling him back. "This stone can grant wishes, but there's always a price. Usually the wisher ends up regretting it." Clark's curiosity turned to chill as he looked at Ikens' skeletal body. His fairy tale ideas of treasure vanished. "This thing is evil. Maybe we should bury it." David considered it, then shook his head. Although he didn't trust the stone, he also could see a use for it. No, if there's an extreme emergency, this could be the only option left. Even his mother, Martha, had taken the Dionysus factor just yesterday afternoon because of the heat, jealous of her husband's constant vitality. But the Dionysus factor's immortality wasn't absolute. If a body were utterly destroyed, it might be irreversible. If something truly permanent happened, he would rather summon whatever devil, call it God, and make a deal to bring his parents back. If a devil demanded a price, let it take him. Bringing someone back might be impossible for him, but killing a god was not. Clark's face changed suddenly, as if recalling something catastrophic. "Oh, school." He sounded as if he'd spotted an approaching apocalypse. Because of the emergency, their abilities had been exposed. "You and I showed our powers to classmates. Now that they're recovered, how will they see us? Will they be scared? Did they call the police?" He didn't want his family's quiet life torn apart. "Let's go back and see." David's expression shifted. He wasn't especially worried about exposing himself, but his parents would be devastated and unlikely to leave. "If not," David said, a thought flickering across his face, "maybe we could find a death row inmate who wouldn't mind making a wish and paying the cost." The idea of exploiting the stone's cruel bargain crossed his mind, and, for a moment, he wondered if such a loophole might be usable. Chapter 77. A New Way to Get Emotion Points. When Clark and David rushed back to school, their classmates had already lost all memory of having been enchanted and controlled. The only thing everyone remembered was a stunningly beautiful woman walking into the classroom and announcing herself as the new teacher, Ijin C. At Rex Manor, Rex Luthor sat behind his desk, rubbing his temples as if trying to press a missing piece of thought back into place. A hollow feeling nagged at him. "Have I forgotten something?" he muttered. All he could clearly recall was a fiery woman bursting into his office. After that, nothing. The expression on his face shifted to something darker. He crouched down and opened his safe. Empty. His worst fear had come true. The wishing stone, the relic that could grant wishes, was gone. "Was it that woman?" he whispered. But a different sensation followed. His mind felt sharper than it had in weeks. Complex knowledge about memory science snapped into place, and experimental ideas crowded in: exoskeleton armor, a new energy source. It was as if a wish had already been granted, yet he could not remember making any such wish. Rex frowned, searching desperately for fragments, but nothing resolved. What exactly happened? He asked the empty room. Icon's power explained the student's blankness. Once she left the people she had enchanted, they would lose the memory of her. For years, she had used this ability to seduce and swindle men out of their fortunes. Without the memory wipe, she'd be discovered and hunted. That same cleanup saved David and Clark. The small memory lapse among the class wasn't enough to raise serious alarm in a town used to odd occurrences. The police checked for neurological drugs and found none. Life returned to normal. Summer was coming, and with it, graduation. Everyone was sentimental about leaving the high school campus where friendships had been made. Entrepreneurs among the students began selling souvenir trinkets. In the corridor after class, Clark and David were approached by Pietro and Chloe at one of the stalls. "David, aren't you going to get a graduation ring to mark the end of high school?" Clark asked. David, who'd been unusually distracted for days, shook his head. He wasn't the nostalgic type. "You mean spend dozens, even hundreds of dollars on a ring that costs a few dollars to make? No thanks. A commemorative ring will only make my future self want to slap my past self." Chloe, wearing a brass ring engraved with Smallville High School, smiled awkwardly. "Ignore him. If it's meaningful to you, that's what matters." Pietro dragged Clark over to the stall. Clark picked an ebony ring for Pietro, and after some thought, chose a ring that looked like it had a ruby inlaid. He knew the gem was probably plastic or synthetic, but that didn't matter. Clark glanced at the inscription, Smallville High School, and slipped the ring on. The moment it settled on his finger, a peculiar sensation shot through him, like an ice cube pressed to his back. A shiver, widened eyes, and then a rush of exhilaration and clarity. Thoughts that tasted of euphoria and reckless confidence flashed across his mind. "How does it feel?" Pietro asked. "Never felt better," Clark said, smiling. He felt unshackled, his mind humming with activity in a way it hadn't before. A rare glint lit his eyes as he glanced at David. For a moment his smile wavered, and then returned. There would be time for that later. It was a holiday, and though exams were near, neither brother treated them as a problem. Clark would probably spend time with Lana despite Whitney's mysterious disappearance, making Lana uneasy. David, meanwhile, had other plans. He had been curious about the ripple he'd created in time when he encountered Icons. Taking advantage of the free morning, he went to the National Museum of Natural History in Washington to look for Wonder Woman, who'd long been rumored to have worked there under the name Diana Prince. At the marble-floored hall, the receptionist gave him a polite but firm answer. "Diana Prince? I'm sorry. After triple checking, we have no one by that name on our conservation or appraisal staff." David left the museum surprised and kept asking around town. No one could recall a mysterious woman wielding a golden lariat to rescue victims. Had his time ripple been larger than he realized? Or had Wonder Woman never left Paradise Island at all? Standing in the fountain square, watching white pigeons wheel through the air, David stared into the distance. Lately, one thought dominated him: emotion points. Aside from special characters, heroes, and other extraordinary individuals, those points were produced by people with unusual powers. There simply weren't enough of those people. Even in Smallville, the number of power users was small. He'd met fewer than 10. The sum of emotion points they contributed didn't come close to a fraction of what Clark could provide. Most template fusion improvement depended on Clark. With Clark's new strength, he sometimes yielded 60 or 70 emotion points in a single surge. But what if there were a whole species, a whole group of extraordinary beings? A bright idea flashed across David's face. If a race or community of powerful beings existed, the emotion points they could provide would be enormous. A whole new avenue had just opened up in his mind, a way to collect far more emotion points than any single hero could ever give. Chapter 78, Don't Do Anything You'll Regret. "Are you kidding me? Did you dial the wrong number?" Jonathan hung up the phone, incredulous. "What? Thank you." Martha, flipping pancakes at the stove, looked up. "What's wrong?" "The credit card company just called to confirm some charges." Jonathan frowned as he scrolled through the email of transaction alerts. A stack of receipts showed their family card had been used for a significant sum this morning. He reached instinctively for his wallet and froze. The card was gone. "Martha, when did we put a satellite dish on the barn?" She turned toward the window and stopped. A shiny new dish had been mounted on the second-floor wall of the barn. Jonathan and Martha exchanged confused looks and walked outside together. Up close, the barn had been altered beyond recognition. Arcade machines hummed where tractors should be, racks of leather and band t-shirts hung from the rafters, and a few electric guitars were mounted on the wall like trophies. "When did our tool barn turn into an arcade?" Jonathan muttered. A voice behind them answered that question with perfect timing. "Son." They turned. David, just back from Washington, coat buttoned, hands in his pockets, stood in the barn doorway, surprise on his face. From upstairs came the rattling explosions of a video game matched with a soundtrack of hard rock. It looked like the dream den of any boy who loved games and guitars. "Did we win the lottery?" David murmured, raising an eyebrow. He had plans. He couldn't disappear for no reason. He was supposed to wait until after exams and break before looking for Paradise Island, but he hadn't expected their barn to be so grand. The three of them climbed the stairs. On the attic landing, Clark sat slouched in a black leather jacket, the image of someone trying very hard to be rebellious. He didn't look up from a fighting game as the speakers rattled the rafters. "Die, die! How many hits can you block?" he shouted at the screen, fingers flying over the controller. "Eddie's in Metropolis," Clark said without turning, voice glued to the TV. "Open 24 hours, discounts." "You used our credit card to buy all this?" Martha's voice shook. She had always pictured her eldest son as a shy, bookish boy. He wouldn't do something like this without asking. "Clark, did you steal our money?" Clark still didn't look up. Jonathan, finally provoked by the volume, stomped toward the console and slammed the speakers off. The room fell suddenly flat and quiet. Clark tossed the controller aside and stood. "Isn't there enough work on this broken farm for you to do?" he snapped. David's face went hard. That wasn't the Clark he knew. Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment, trying to process the unexpected insolence. "Clark, we never taught you to speak to your parents like that." Clark's voice cut through them. "Stop preaching. You're not even my real parents." Martha staggered back like she'd been struck. Her hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes shone with hurt. Jonathan's face went white. "Clark Kent, apologize to Mom and Dad right now," David ordered, suddenly cold. "Or you'll go back to school with a black eye." Clark laughed, ugly and bitter. A ring with a deep red stone flashed on his hand. David's gaze snagged on it. The color wasn't the sickly glow of green rocks. They were something else entirely, and Clark's behavior fit the description. Abrupt mood swings, aggression. A memory, a scrap of old comic lore, slid into place. "There are other kinds of kryptonite," David said quietly. "Green weakens, gold strips powers forever, black splits. Red makes them unpredictable, feral." Clark's tone was filled with contempt. "I've been sick of you for a long time. You should know who's older and who's younger in this family." Something in Clark's voice, and the way he said it, was pure malice. David stepped forward, wary. "Take off that ring, Clark. Don't tell me what to do." Clark's face twisted with rage. He reached behind him and pulled out a strange stone, gray with clumps of yellow crystal growing across its surface. David's jaw tightened. That was the wishing stone he'd locked in his bedside drawer, the thing he'd hidden after what happened with Ikens. He'd thought Clark was too repulsed by it to touch it. He'd been wrong. "What are you going to do with that?" David asked. "Eliminate my only weakness," Clark said simply, clutching the stone so hard his knuckles whitened. He looked like he was seeing victory already. "Fortunately, I have this. Don't do something you'll regret, Clark." David raised a hand, ready to blast the stone out of his brother's grip. Wishing might carry a price, and he couldn't guess what the stone would demand. Clark moved first. Faster than David expected, he was gone from the attic and reappeared downstairs as if he'd teleported. He laughed. "Speed's never been your thing, little brother." David had a brief, sharp image of Clark at the attic railing, and then he steadied himself and said the one wish that could tip the balance. "I wish for all meteorites that could weaken me to disappear." The world shifted. Dark clouds scudded in from nowhere, lightning braided through them, and in towns and fields across the area, the tiny, glittering green fragments that had once given Kryptonians trouble, stones tucked into boxes and jars, chunks hidden under floorboards, vanished. The box under David's bed that had been full of samples sat empty. The streams of light that used to be visible to his sight were gone. The annoying, irritating glow that had marked weakness disappeared with a whisper. "From today on, there will be nothing that can restrain me," Clark crowed, clenching his fists until his knuckles cracked. He stuffed the wishing stone into his pocket and grinned up at David, wild with triumph. "Now I'll teach you how a proper younger brother behaves." From behind the house, Jonathan and Martha watched in stunned silence, fear and heartbreak written across their faces. Marie's whisper was barely audible. "You're being reckless, Clark." David's expression hardened. He narrowed his eyes. Behind the house, Jonathan and Martha crouched together, watching their two sons face off. The air between them crackled with tension. Both parents wore lines of worry, hands clasped so tightly their knuckles were white. "Clark used that evil stone," Martha whispered, panic breaking through. "David said it's like making a deal with the devil. What are we going to do?" They'd both been filled in after an entire class had lost a period of memory. David and Clark had told them about the wishing stone. It sounded absurd until you considered the rest: a wizard's diary, enchanted metal that could revive the dead and grant youth. After David's detailed account, they'd accepted it as truth. "Was that ring that changed Clark the work of that stone?" Jonathan ground his teeth. The idea was crazy, but everything fit together too well to dismiss. On the yard, Clark snapped, "Enough! Don't talk to me like that. I'm the older brother." The boy's voice had gone sharp and cold. With a terrifying burst of power, he cracked the ground and swung at David. David's eyes narrowed. He let universe energy roll through him like a rising tide. "Template fusion 56%, he muttered to himself as his power surged. The speed at which he could amplify his energy jumped dramatically, close to 10 times the speed of sound. Clark was faster still. David couldn't track the arc of his fist, only felt the air compress as Clark approached like a missile. David threw his own fist out, and a stream of purple energy, man-high and hot enough to melt steel, blasted forward. Clark sneered and slipped through the torrent, reappearing to land a brutal blow against David's jaw. "You underestimate me." The red kryptonite had altered Clark's personality as much as his power. He was no longer a simple, good-natured kid. He'd turned cunning and vicious. Their blows detonated shockwaves, and a windstorm swept the farm for hundreds of meters. Jonathan and Martha pressed themselves farther back behind the house, mouths covered, faces drained of color. David stood still and absorbed the attack. The kinetic force the punch carried, the kind that could have been measured in thousands of tons of TNT, simply disappeared into him. He compressed the energy into his other fist and with a volcanic force blasted Clark away. The younger boy skidded across the dirt for over 100 meters before scrambling to his feet, chest heaving and burning with pain. "You always had to show off," David said coldly, and began firing rapid energy blasts. Clark zipped and twisted, dodging where he could, but he was baiting David too, slowing down on purpose to taunt. A total change in personality only means different weaknesses, David thought. Where Clark had once been kind even in defeat, now there were no excuses, only malice. "You third-rate villain," David snapped. "How dare you talk to me like that, you Earth native?" Clark roared back. "You have no idea how powerful my talent is." Anger fed him, and he launched a furious barrage, fists that could have cracked an aircraft carrier, interspersed with heat vision capable of cutting through anything. David kept his face impassive and pushed his energy control to the limit, absorbing most of it and redirecting blasts from his hands and eyes to box Clark in. Clark's attacks rarely moved him. Even when David took a dozen hits and only landed one in return, that single blow was enough to hurt. "No," Clark spat between punches. "You're from a backward planet that can't do interstellar travel. How do you compare to me?" His pride flamed, and with every blow his output climbed, becoming more violent. David frowned. The kinetic energy he was absorbing kept growing more intense. It wasn't yet dangerous, but the trend worried him. "You feel it, don't you? I used to be weak, scared of my power and what I was." Clark's punches grew more desperate and more powerful. "But I am not the old me. My body's potential far exceeds your imagination." His fists erupted like miniature volcanoes. If David hadn't been so perfect at absorbing energy, the ground would have cracked long ago. As it was, the winds sent houses swaying. Mist rays melted earth into pools of lava. Jonathan dragged Martha behind a small hill, both of them in shock at the spectacle. The two boys hit with a force and speed that made them look like gods clashing. If anyone else came near, they'd see. If this continued, the barn and house wouldn't survive. David tried repeatedly to grab Clark's hand and melt the red kryptonite ring with a precise energy beam, but Clark's speed gave him the advantage. Clark knew what would happen if the ring came off. He dodged relentlessly. The barrage of energy grew dangerous. David stopped holding back. "Even if I get hurt, I can recover," he said, firing I-beams and hand cannons in a staccato of pressure that forced Clark into tighter and tighter arcs. His options dwindled. But David's energy guns began to falter, thinning like water from a near-empty faucet. "Not enough, David," Clark sneered, suddenly understanding something. "You still haven't realized who you are." Their heat vision flashed back and forth, momentarily matching, and Clark charged. "Your energy can't sustain your extravagance anymore," he shouted, closing the distance. He slammed a punch toward David's face, and in the same instant, David grabbed the strike. Clark felt certain of victory and unleashed a blast of heat vision with a wild, savage laugh, veins around his eyes blazing red. "My energy comes from the sun," Clark shouted through the pain. "As long as the sun doesn't set, I am invincible." He drove his fist forward, believing himself unassailable. David answered with a sudden intensification of his own I-beams, purple now, and their two energies collided. At first, they destroyed each other, but then David's rays surged, focused and ruthless, and a fierce purple light slammed directly into Clark's eyes like molten water. "Ah!" Clark staggered, clutching his face as pain lanced through his skull. His vision went white-hot, and he stumbled back. "You despicable!" Clark spluttered, disoriented and furious. David didn't answer him with words. He aimed precisely at the ring on Clark's finger and fired a final concentrated ray. It struck true. The red kryptonite, the ring Clark had worn and bought that morning, began to vaporize. It melted and burned away, disappearing into smoke. "No!" Clark gasped, hand frantic and searching, but it was already gone. His fingers burned where the ring had been. He reached toward the empty space, but it was too late. As the ring disappeared, the surge of malice inside Clark drained away just as quickly as it had come, and the savage glare on his face faded. A few seconds of confusion gave way to panic. What have I done?" The world was still blurry, but Clark's mind raced. He remembered how cruel he'd been to his parents, the disrespectful things he'd said to his brother, and the way the fight had turned physical. "All those hurtful words," he whispered. David breathed a long sigh of relief. Jonathan and Martha rushed to their eldest son the moment they realized he'd come back to himself. "Son, are you all right?" they asked, hugging him with worried faces. Jonathan inspected both boys. David hadn't even a tear in his clothes after the struggle, but Clark's shirt was nearly blasted to shreds, his eyes swollen and streaming, red and irritated from crying, leaving him disheveled. Clark clung to his parents and, shaken, apologized again and again. "Mom, Dad, David, I'm sorry." "It's all right, son. We know that wasn't you," Martha soothed, gently stopping him from continuing to beat himself up. "What happened?" Jonathan asked. "Was it the ring?" "It was that ring, the ring." Clark could only repeat. As soon as he'd put it on, he'd gone mad. His normal consciousness had been suppressed, as if another personality had taken over. He couldn't explain why, only that it had felt like something inside him had taken control. It must have been the meteorite. David stepped forward, trying to make sense of things. "Besides the meteorite that came with Clark, I can't think of any other cause." Jonathan frowned. "Aren't most meteorites green? We've never seen one like that before." He looked between them, unsettled. "So green meteorites affect the body, and red ones affect the mind?" Clark kept apologizing like a child who'd done something unforgivable. David put a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay. At least you're back." But David's brow stayed drawn. He wasn't angry at Clark. He was worried. Clark made a wish. "I still don't know what the price will be." Clark had been able to squint open his eyes at first, but as the sun rose and the swelling around them subsided, something else happened. His vision went completely dark. He groped in panic. "I can't see." "Did your brother hit you too hard?" Martha and Jonathan exchanged frightened looks. David frowned. His energy could do terrible things, but it hadn't been used to strike Clark's eyes. And it was daytime now. Clark's eyes should have been healing. Clark opened his lids again. They looked gray, like ash. There was a strange calm on his face, as if he'd already made peace with the punishment he'd received. "This is the price of my wish," he said. A silence fell over the room. Jonathan and Martha stared at their son's empty gaze. "Does this mean, are you blind now, Clark? Permanently?" "Maybe this is the best it could be," Clark said, turning to his mother and taking her cold hand. Though his voice trembled, he tried to smile through the fear. He worried most that whatever the wishing stone demanded might hurt his family. "If it's only my sight, I can live with that." "It shouldn't be permanent," David said, frowning. He knew the wishing stone originated from a god of lies. If it had been something like Zeus, it might command powers beyond a normal Kryptonian's comprehension, but other gods wouldn't necessarily be able to take away Clark's gifts forever. "We'll figure this out." Clark tried to sound confident. "I've still got my hearing." The usual remedy, sunlight restoring his injuries, hadn't worked this time, but he clung to hope. "Give me time. I'll learn to get by." For the next few days, David quietly cleaned up the signs of the fight so nothing would draw unwanted attention. Clark adapted faster than anyone expected. Within 2 or 3 days, he moved through the world with a practiced ease that masked how much he'd lost. With sunglasses and a cane, most people wouldn't realize he was blind. It didn't stop him from living. A week later, both brothers finished their exams. Their grades weren't perfect, just solid, excellent marks, but good enough. Trying to get higher would have been easy for them, but it would only bring attention they didn't want. Jonathan looked at their report cards on the kitchen table and smiled with pride. "These are good," he said. "You two could make a fortune as athletes if you wanted, pull in tens of millions a year. Far more talented than this old farmer who only knows how to handle a plow." He grinned and then became more serious. "So, what are your plans for the holidays?" Martha beamed. Her sons had always been a source of comfort when it came to their studies. College seemed like a formality. Both boys had chosen Metropolis State University, close enough to Smallville that it wouldn't be a wrench. "Any summer plans?" she asked. "Chloe's going to intern at the Daily Planet in Metropolis, and she wants me to help her," Clark said. "She asked me to be her assistant." David raised an eyebrow. The idea of Clark and reporting intersecting so soon felt like destiny. "Sounds like your future secret identity might start early," he teased. "Even blind, you'll have better hearing than any reporter." Clark laughed softly. Losing his sight had given him a new perspective. He'd begun thinking more about people who lived with disadvantages and how little he'd appreciated his gifts before. "Maybe Dad's right. God gave me these abilities for a reason. I should accept them and use them." There was a quiet maturity in his voice that hadn't been there before. David studied him, surprised. "Maybe this temporary blindness, whatever its cause, has pushed you a little closer to becoming the man of tomorrow." Clark shrugged. "I don't know about a masked vigilante. Would I be some kind of superpowered daredevil? I haven't thought that far." He scratched his head, uncertain. Being a public figure with extraordinary abilities could drag his family into danger. He couldn't promise anything about the future. People changed. "What about you?" Clark asked, turning toward his brother. "Me? I might travel," David said, looking out the window at the blue sky and drifting clouds, his gaze stretching beyond the nearby hills. "Traveling?" Clark echoed. If David's thoughts were spoken, they might have sounded brash, but inside his mind, he was already planning. If he could force a transcendent race to react to him, make their emotions fluctuate because of his presence, his ability fusion rate would skyrocket. Paradise Island, home to thousands of Amazon warriors, was one possibility. There were other transcendent races on Earth as well, like the Atlanteans beneath the sea. Meeting them, testing his limits, learning from them, those were the kinds of places where his powers could grow faster than anywhere else.